Subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's subcommittee, joint subcommittee on health and subcommittee on economic opportunity oversight hearing on veteran homelessness. I want to apologize first for being a little late. I had another obligation in my responsibility on the budget committee. And my colleague Brad Winstrip, chair of the health subcommittee, will not be able to make it, and so I'm going to preside. We have the VHA subcommittee chair, Julie Brownlee, and her capable leadership. Thanks for being here. And then my friend from Texas and ranking member on the subcommittee for economic opportunity, Beto O'Rourke, is joining me as well. We have our chairman who is joining us, so thank you, Dr. Rowe, for coming. I want to begin also by asking for unanimous consent for Congressman Mike Kaufman, Congressman Scott Peters, and I guess that's it, to sit in on the dais and participate in today's hearing. I don't hear any objection, and so ordered. I'm going to cut through my remarks here and break from my customary reading a script and just say that this is a subject that is heartbreaking. And when you look at the statistics on veteran homelessness and the underlying issues that our veterans struggle with, many and maybe mostly on account of the burden that they bore for us and for our country and for our freedom. It's just gut-wrenching. And there's not an issue, I don't believe, that's more important than to find ways to help and serve this segment of the veteran population. As I read and studied up and prepared on background, I noticed that there's been an exponential increase in funding in this area, and there's some 20-plus programs across the various agencies. With respect to the VA, most of this is at the VHA, but that's a lot of programs, and that's a tremendous increase in funding. Here's my deal. Is it working? What's working? What's not working? How do we measure the success of these programs? Because it is only because of the generosity of the taxpayer that we have this opportunity. And so I have a number of questions. I think it's encouraging to see a significant decline in homelessness over the course of the last several years. On account of, I think, the commitment from a secretary and administration in the past. And as somebody once told me, if you throw enough money at something, you're going to see the needle move. But are we spending it wisely, effectively? And then how do we focus these resources where they can have the greatest return? A, to help the veteran. B, to assure our taxpayers that their money is going, as being productively spent. With that, I think let's get this hearing started. And again, I apologize because I was not going to open this up. But let's go ahead and introduce our panelist. Okay, I'm gonna defer to you, Madam Ranking Member Brownlee, and ask that you provide any opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just would like to say that I concur with everything that you've said in your remarks. And I would add that in 2009, former Secretary Shinseki pledged a commitment to ending homelessness among veterans. In 2014, former Secretary McDonald also committed to this pledge to end homelessness among veterans. Between 2009 and 2016, veteran homelessness was reduced by 47%. In 2017, Secretary Shulkin shared his top 5 priorities for the VA, and as many may be aware, ending veterans' homelessness was not included in that list of priorities. I fear, based on the actions of this administration thus far, that in the coming years we will continue to lose ground in our fight against veteran homelessness. In 2017, HUD's annual survey found that veteran homelessness increased by 1.5%. However, when you drill down into these numbers and look at specific communities, the picture is much more alarming. Los Angeles County, which I represent a part of, saw a 57% increase in the number of homeless veterans just in the past year. I'd like to enter into the record a letter from the LA County Board of Supervisors, the mayor, United Way, and the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority that outlines the challenges ahead to end veteran homelessness.
Yes.
Thank you very much. These local partners are committed to working together with the VA and other federal agencies to ensure all veterans have access to safe and affordable housing. There is no doubt combating veteran homelessness must be an interagency effort. In 2014, when we last held a hearing on this issue, and is why I wanted to hold this hearing, because it's been several years since we've gotten an update, John Downing, CEO of Soldier On, said, based on his experience, that 100% of homeless female veterans encountered and have survived military sexual trauma. Without the VA, HUD would not know how to treat the underlying trauma and injuries that MST can lead to. Without HUD, the VA would not have the housing assistance expertise necessary to ensuring that veterans receive permanent housing as part of their treatment. And finally, without the Department of Labor, that veteran would be hard-pressed to overcome the barriers faced by many, if not all, transitioning veterans seeking employment in the civilian market. This is the same for many veterans, whether they are survivors of sexual assault, struggling with addiction, or managing mental health conditions. These veterans are complex, their issues are complex, the solution is complex, but by working together, we can build on the gains we made over the last 7 years, which saw 3 states and 57 communities eliminate veteran homelessness altogether. The progress made during those 7 years was, quite frankly, incredible, and it was in large part due to the hard work of the case managers, social workers, healthcare personnel, counselors, volunteers, and veterans themselves. I commend the hard work of our boots-on-the-ground organizations and the commitment of agency officials during this time, some of whom are testifying today. And I question why this administration would backtrack on that solution and risk the lives of homeless veterans nationwide. I hope the President's budget this year reflects a newfound commitment to ending veteran homelessness through an allocation of funding that supports both the housing and wraparound services necessary to heal and house these veterans. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I thank you for your commitment to this issue, and I look forward to our discussion ahead.
Thank you, Ranking Member Brownlee. I now yield 5 minutes for opening remarks for Ranking Member O'Rourke from the great state of Texas.
That's right. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brownlee, I want to thank you and the staffs that work with you and the staffs that work on the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee for the work that's gone into preparing for this hearing. This is why I love serving on this committee, the fact that Chairman Rowe is here, the fact that members who are not even on the committees of jurisdiction have asked to have the privilege of sitting here and being helpful as we try to address this issue of veterans homelessness, which is not provocative, it's not sensational, it doesn't grab headlines, it's not one of those things that people are on late night TV screaming at each other about, but it could not be more important. And the fact that we're able to, across party lines, work together and do what's important, much the way that we've addressed access to mental health and meeting the crisis of veteran suicide head-on, making progress in that very important underserved area. I feel that we'll be able to do the same here. And the only thing, Mr. Chairman, that I could add to your comments, you say that it is because of the generosity of the taxpayer that we have the opportunity to do this work. It's also thanks to the service of those veterans whose service we are honoring by our commitment to make sure that none of them are homeless, that we get that down to zero in every single one of our communities, whether that's functional zero or real zero, and that may be part of the conversation today. We need to make sure it's both the resources and, to your point, the oversight, the accountability, the follow-through to make sure that these programs are working. And I'm just so pleased that we have such an important panel before us, those who understand and work on this issue directly, who are going to be able to inform the policy that we make here and to improve our level of oversight and the accountability from the VA and the federal government. And lastly, I just want to thank Mr. John Martin from the Opportunity Center in El Paso. As someone who makes this flight every single week, I know how hard it is to get from El Paso to Washington, D.C., and I know that you almost didn't make it due to some problems with some of those connections. And so the fact that you take some time out of what you're doing, the important work in serving veterans in El Paso to be here and help us, just know that we're grateful, and I extend that gratitude to everyone on this panel. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. And now we will get to our first panel. I'd like to welcome you guys again this morning. Thank you for making time for this very important issue, and we're honored to have you here. Let's start with John F. Clancy, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Tri-State Veterans Community Alliance, which is located in Cincinnati, Ohio. Mr. Clancy, thanks for being here today. And representing the Ohioans you serve, Angela F. Williams is next. She's President and Chief Executive Officer of Easter Seals Incorporated. Stephen Peck, the President and Chief Executive Officer of U.S. Vets. John W. Martin, the Development Director for the Opportunity Center. And finally, Catherine Monet, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. Thank you guys again for being here. Mr. Clancy, we'll start with you. We now recognize you for 5 minutes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Clancy. I'm an Air Force veteran. I serve as the President and CEO of the Tri-State Veteran Community Alliance, or TVCA, in Cincinnati, Ohio. Thank you for inviting me to testify today at this important hearing regarding support for our veterans in need. As an independent, veteran-led nonprofit organization focused on improving the access to and the quality of services offered to veterans and their families, we appreciate the opportunity to share our perspective and provide recommendations to address the needs of veterans in distress. The TVCA was created 4 years ago to serve as a backbone organization responsible for aligning veteran support in our region. We partner with over 150 local organizations and operate a veteran in-processing center that has meaningfully serviced and met the needs of more than 1,150 veterans since opening 28 months ago. In addition, we have piloted programs that fill gaps in our community not currently filled by our partner organizations, such as an accelerated career training and placement program for mid-level non-commissioned officers and an educational storytelling event for veterans to share their journey with local citizens. To ensure success within our workgroup and piloted programs, we leverage our United Way 211 call center and facilitate data sharing efforts both inside and outside our region. Our efforts are characterized by the following aspects. We are proactive, seeking to engage veterans and their families before a crisis happens. We seek collaboration whenever possible. We work across sectors. We have many businesses involved in our efforts, but also include social services, veteran organizations, and all major educational institutions. And finally, we look for systemic solutions in addition to program improvement. That said, it is important for the community to assess how the resources provided by the VA, HUD, and DOL impact the lives of all veterans, but more urgently our distressed and/or homeless veteran population. Based on our community needs assessments, the TVCA recommends that resources be considered for downstream programming related to behavioral health, wellness, and social support, addressing what are often the root causes of homelessness, and upstream support for collaborative transitional systems like the TVCA that can intercept veterans and resolve issues before they become a crisis. Over the last decade, the efforts of all three federal agencies have been commendable and successful. The VA designed a research-informed strategy called Housing First to address the problem, especially for those veterans who had experienced chronic homelessness. This strategy involved a co-sponsored initiative with HUD to invest resources in stable, permanent housing for chronically homeless veterans and case management services to prevent them from experiencing further homeless episodes. Other programs, including the DOL's Homeless Veteran Reintegration Program, have also served to facilitate the successful transition of veterans from homelessness. With the current strategy at its 10-year mark, the VA and HUD Housing First programs have successfully reduced veteran homelessness by nearly 50%. However, based on client trends seen in our region, we believe that client needs and demographic profile are beginning to show signs of moving from traditionally homeless individuals to those who are transitioning or at risk. To serve the new customer base, we should begin to adapt the current system to not only focus on homeless veterans, but also successful life transitions for at-risk veterans. To accomplish this shift in mindset, a broader set of outcomes need to be developed that involves not just housing attainment, but boosting veteran self-efficacy, development of clear personal goals, and developing or enhancing the motivation to succeed in the civilian world. For veterans in distress, there are several strategies that correspond to how soon or at what level we engage. At the individual level, for those in acute distress, we need to ensure the right clinical levels of care are accessible and available. At a systemic level, we need to ensure existing organizations are communicating and strategizing across sectors, including the continuums of care, medical centers, and other veteran wellness and support groups. Finally and ultimately, we need to ensure that the transition system from military to civilian life is coordinated, veteran-centered, and resourced. This includes a greater level of information sharing, new and improved programming focused on proactive, strength-building approaches. We believe that upstream regional veteran collaborators like the TVCA in Cincinnati and Combined Arms in Houston, for example, are a key part of the solution. This collaborative approach allows the community to mainstream best practices, decrease competition, and allow for the scaling up of efforts to support transitioning veterans. A coordinated, community-based approach that brings together diverse sets of resources and identifies new opportunities across public and private sectors is needed. We applaud your review of the mix of programs available for veterans, assessing the correct mix for current needs and opportunities. In closing, we would like to stress again the importance of a relevant, trusted community organization that can initiate and sustain the conversation for aligning strategy on transition support, employment, and wellness. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. We now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Williams.
Chairman Arrington, Ranking Members Brownlee and O'Rourke, and members of the subcommittees, good morning. I'm Angela Williams, President and CEO of Easter Seals, a national network of nonprofit organizations committed to helping veterans and others reach their full potential through local services and supports. I am also a proud veteran. Thank you for inviting me to testify this morning on this hearing to assess the various programs designed to reduce veteran homelessness. Easter Seals has been actively serving veterans for more than 7 decades. My testimony will highlight Easter Seals' experience in responding to the needs of homeless and at-risk veterans through employment and other supports needed for their successful community reintegration. In 2010, about the time Easter Seals started a new phase in its effort to help homeless veterans, our country's veteran homeless population grew to over 74,000. Today, that number has dropped nearly 46% due to strong collaboration between federal, state, and local partners and the complementary alignment of programs across various federal agencies. In my written testimony, I shared the story of Paula, a veteran who moved to New York City to find work and turn her life around. Her job search was complicated by employment barriers that proved too difficult to overcome. Defeated and homeless, she turned to a women's shelter where, thankfully, she was referred to Easter Seals for employment assistance. We leveraged our community partners to help Paula with housing, resume development, interview preparation, obtaining the appropriate wardrobe, and subway cards to get to job interviews. Today, Paula is living independently, working full-time, and contributing to her community thanks to the National Veteran Homeless Strategy developed by Congress and implemented by federal agencies. Paula's story highlights the effective collaboration and alignment of the Department of Veteran Affairs' Supportive Services for Veterans Families Programs, or SSVF, the Department of Housing and Urban Development and VA Supportive Housing Program, HUD-VASH, and the Department of Labor's Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, or HVRP. It takes the strengths, resources, and collaboration of many to help veterans succeed. Easter Seals' distinction in this national effort is to help homeless veterans find jobs. Our expertise serving most in-need job seekers made us a natural partner with the Department of Labor on its HVRP program, which is employment-focused and a perfect complement to the housing focus of HUD-VASH and the VA's Supportive Services for Veterans Families program. The Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program taps into the existing community network by providing grants to local organizations. Easter Seals operates 11 HVRP grants nationwide. We provided HVRP employment services to nearly 1,200 homeless veterans last program year, and are proud to share that 61% found jobs during that year, with wages averaging from $10 to nearly $21 per hour. Once unemployed and homeless, these veterans are now working, paying taxes, and contributing to their communities. Their success represents a strong return on the HVRP federal investment, which averages about $2,500 per veteran. Easter Seals is honored to be part of the solution in reducing veteran homelessness, but our work is not finished. I include recommendations in my written testimony to build on the strong foundation Congress has set for addressing veteran homelessness. Let me boil them down to two main points. One, Congress should support full funding and a long-term extension for the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program. Easter Seals supports the bipartisan effort to extend and expand HVRP. Additional funding is necessary to meet the growing needs of the chronically homeless and hardest to serve veterans, who will require more supports and time to find employment and housing success. Two, Congress should expand early access to community-based support services. The first step is to approve Chairman Winstrup and Ranking Member Brownlee's bill, H.R. 4451, that expands veteran eligibility to HVRP services. Congress should also consider ways to expand federally funded community case management to proactively meet the challenges of veterans well before they meet the homeless and unemployed eligibility criteria of programs like HVRP and SSVF. Thank you for your time today. I'm pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Peck, 5 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Stephen Peck, and I'm the President and CEO of U.S. Vets. I'm also a Vietnam veteran. I served with the 1st Marine Division near Da Nang in '69 and '70, and I've been working for homeless veterans since 1991. U.S. Vets is the largest veteran-specific nonprofit housing and service provider in the country, providing housing and services to 3,300 veterans every night, and providing homelessness prevention, employment, and mental health services to an additional 5,000 veterans in the communities that we serve. I'm also the president of the California Association of Veteran Service Agencies, comprised of 7 veteran nonprofits that collectively provide housing and care to more than 25,000 veterans each year. Despite hundreds of millions of dollars spent, numerous government policies, and the best efforts of hundreds of communities, there are still more than 40,000 veterans living on our streets, and that number is rising across the nation. In California, the number of homeless veterans rose nearly 20% in 2017, and in Los Angeles, that number rose 57%. This is no time to be taking our eye off the ball. Despite this upward trend, it seems to us that there was no longer an emphasis and determination to get every veteran off the streets. This shift in focus is evident in 2 ways. First, the proposal by the VA to take permanent housing supportive service dollars out of the special projects category where it is protected, and placing these dollars into the general fund where medical directors can redirect it at will. While they have said they will not shift these dollars, the VASH funds remain in the general fund line item. And second, VA's overall management of the HUD-VASH program. It is plagued by lack of accountability, insufficient data collection, and inadequate outcome measures. Together, these factors can inhibit our ability to get veterans off the streets and into permanent housing and provide the case management and supportive services that will keep them there. The Housing First model that the VA professes to follow requires a client-case manager ratio of 25:1. Additionally, it requires access to assistance with a simple phone call 24 hours a day. That is not what's happening. We have project-based VASH beds at 5 of our sites, and VA social workers are consistently failing to provide the required coverage. For 75 VASH vouchers, the VA is required to provide 3 full-time case managers. We never have 3. We rarely have 2. And our clinical staff picks up the slack. If a nonprofit such as US Vets provided that level of coverage while contracted with the VA, we would lose the contract. I've attached 3 letters to my written testimony from 3 different communities that have been awarded HUD vouchers, 2 in California and 1 in Florida. In each case, the VA has indicated that it does not have the resources to provide adequate case-managed coverage for the number of HUD vouchers awarded. The result is that the vouchers go unused while veterans languish on the streets. If I understand correctly, funding that Congress has appropriated to the VA specifically for VASH case management positions is for some reason not available. Veterans still living on our streets need every dollar of this funding. If the VASH program were turned into a grant program, experienced veteran nonprofits would assume full responsibility, would spend every dollar appropriately, and could be held to outcome measures that we are already meeting and exceeding. Because our programs are residential, we have staff 24/7 and are used to responding to client issues day and night. US Vets provide case management for 423 beds of permanent supportive housing with a 92% retention rate. By contrast, a recent Inspector General study reports a 70% success rate in the HUD-VASH program. This study also states that the reason the vast majority of those veterans exited the program was unknown, quote, as HUD's systems do not have the capacity to track this information, unquote. This is just careless. Homeless veterans' rate of attempted suicide is 20 times higher than the rate of suicide attempts among all veterans. They are plainly at risk and desperate for our help, and we need better data on how federal funding is serving or failing them. We've all been at this for a long time, and you've put a lot of money into this, so you might ask, what is your return on investment? My 25 years of experience tells me that if you pull back now, the number of homeless veterans on the street will continue to grow, and they will use the only services available to them, expensive mental health and medical services. They will spend time in jail and homeless shelters, and they will continue to die, having been abandoned by the country they fought for. Combating homelessness is not a one-time fix. It is an ongoing effort to mitigate the inequality that exists in our system for veterans, who, through lack of opportunity, lack of education, mental illness, combat trauma, or other deficits, end up on the margins of society. We are paying for this tragedy one way or another. We simply have to make the decision that these veterans' lives are worth saving. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peck. Mr. Martin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. My name is John Martin. I am the Development Director for the Opportunity Center for the Homeless in El Paso, Texas. And I think that statement in and of itself is important because my comments are going to be reflective of a community that's struggling as it relates to ending homelessness, whether it be veterans, chronically homeless, or the families and youth. The other aspect of this, as I mentioned to a couple folks as we've started this, is I felt a little bit like a fish out of water from the standpoint that I tend to live more in the HUD world than I do the VA. But it's also very important that we need to understand how the two need to overlap with one another as we work through this. The Opportunity Center for the Homeless has existed now for over 24 years in El Paso. I've had the pleasure of working with them for 4. As a development director, I do a lot of strategy and a lot of thinking. Many might consider my position to be that of a professional beggar as a general description. The truth of the matter is we care for a majority of the homeless in El Paso, and that includes the chronic homeless. Of our population that we serve, roughly 15% are veterans. And these are individuals that do not qualify based on eligibility requirements associated with the VA. So we're looking at the other end of the spectrum. As a direct result, we have to rely on HUD funding for that purpose. And there's already been a reference during this testimony to the Housing First initiative, an initiative that has severely hampered our efforts in El Paso. Housing First is an incredible program, so I don't want anybody to take those comments the wrong way. But in respect, all of our funding within the community is now directing toward increasing our housing inventory and not that of support services. And the two must go hand in hand. As an example, just over the last 5 years, we've lost $1.2 million per year as a community, not as an organization, as it relates to support services. Now that includes employment, legal, transportation, medical care, mental health, street outreach. And in turn, as a community, we've lost a little over $500,000 with regard to overall funding. And so what we're facing is a struggle at this point is to provide the appropriate level of services that are needed, not only for placement within housing under the Housing First initiative, which is an incredible tool, but also with regard to sustainability and how to prevent recidivism. In my written testimony, I gave you some numbers that are reflective of us as an organization that has 14 programs in 10 different houses. Those 10 houses, 7 of which are permanent housing, one of which is transitional, which is our Veterans Transitional Living Center, which is the GPD program that we operate within the community. The remaining are what you would refer to as emergency shelters, and that's where that 15% lie. And these are individuals that are defined as chronically homeless, both based on disability as well as length of homelessness. And so in turn, when you look at goals such as 25-to-1 on a case management that was stated earlier, which is the ideal situation, we're working in situations where it's 200 to 250-to-1. And that is because of the absence of what we need for those support service dollars. Because we as a community, in general statement, we're a very poor community. A little over 50% of our population falls under 200% of the federal poverty level. So you would say that we have a low tax base. And so we have no local investment with regard to the city or to the county. And so for us, the burden is placed on the service provider. And we're being asked to do more with less. And I think my conclusion here, if I so make that statement, is that in some respects, as it relates to funding, you have to take a look at the unique characteristics of each of the communities, because in many cases, those parameters, those metrics that are imposed on us as an agency that receives funds are restricted in a manner that works in other communities, but not necessarily El Paso. We need to have that flexibility to be able to design a system utilizing those same metrics, but meets the need within the community and the unique characteristics of those that we serve. With that stated, I welcome any questions when that time comes, and I look forward to having further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Ms. Monet, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Rowe, Wenstrup, and Arrington, ranking members Brownlee and O'Rourke, and distinguished members of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I'm Catherine Monet, the CEO of the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. On behalf of our board of directors and members across the country, we thank you for the opportunity to share our views with you this morning. NCHV is the Resource and Technical Assistance Center for a national network of community-based service providers and local, state, and federal agencies that provide a range of housing and supportive services to hundreds of thousands of homeless, at-risk, and formerly homeless veterans across the country. We're committed to working with our partners to end veteran homelessness. The good news is that 60 communities, including 3 states, have achieved the federal benchmarks and criteria for ending veteran homelessness, and this demonstrates for the first time ever that ending homelessness is actually an achievable goal. This progress is largely a testament to the dedication and hard work of local service providers, community partners, and VA Medical Center staff. In the abstract, this is progress towards this major goal, right? But in real terms, it's life-changing for the veterans who've been able to access housing and assistance as a result. Now, the bad news here, as you've heard over and over again this morning, is that our hold on this progress is tenuous at best, as evidenced by the slight increase in the number of veterans between 2016 and 2017. While 36 states and DC all saw decreases in veteran homelessness, other communities with particularly high-cost rental markets saw dramatic increases. From NCHV's perspective, an increase of even 1 veteran is one too many. So this is a really stark reminder to all of us that now is not the time to take our foot off the gas pedal or shift resources from homeless programs to other priorities within VA. We really need to focus on doubling down on these efforts to ensure that homelessness is rare, brief, and non-recurring for veterans and for all Americans. For communities and providers, doubling down really means looking at your community-level data and knowing your homeless neighbors and their needs, right? So that you can really implement evidence-based strategies like Housing First community-wide, and homeless veterans can then access permanent housing quickly and all of the resources like employment and supportive services that they might need for housing stability. We also need to recognize, though, that Housing First never means housing only. So successful implementation of Housing First really includes access to health and mental health care and those wraparound services like benefits assistance, employment and training services, and all of the other things that a veteran needs to make sure that their housing placement is sustainable. Now here in DC, doubling down also means that Congress needs to ensure that key programs that serve veterans experiencing homelessness are sufficiently funded. And at NCHV, we never advocate for the growth of resources for the sake of expanding programs, but the slight uptick in the PIT count, in conjunction with rising rents across much of the country and the series of natural disasters that occurred in 2017, demands nothing short of your continued leadership and attention with regard to both funding and oversight of these programs. Homelessness is a multifaceted and complex problem that differs for every single veteran experiencing it. One of the best ways that we can address it is for Congress to support a permanent authorization for the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness, or USICH. The small team of experts at USICH convenes federal agencies in order to set shared policy priorities and objectives that really can actualize the federal plan to end homelessness. Furthermore, from this unique cross-cutting position, USICH is able to identify and prevent duplication of services that would otherwise waste effort and resources. We can also encourage further collaboration between VA, HUD, DOL, and all other grantees to provide more seamless services to homeless veterans. One of the best examples of interagency collaboration is the HUD-VASH program, as it allows VA to focus its resources more efficiently by pairing VA-funded case management with a HUD-funded Section 8 voucher for some of the most vulnerable veterans we see. The case management funding historically has been distributed to medical centers through a special purpose designation, as the case managers truly must be located where the vouchers are distributed to ensure adequate support for the veterans who are using these vouchers. As you know, last September, VA sent guidance to VISN directors regarding the immediate conversion of this funding from special purpose to general purpose funds. While VA has backed away from this decision for the time being, this could have dramatically reduced case management for vulnerable veterans using these vouchers. And let me be really clear here, NCHV objects in the strongest of terms to this proposed conversion or any action that would reduce case manager availability to veterans using HUD-VASH vouchers. In the 60 communities which have effectively ended veteran homelessness, these vouchers are well known as critical resources that make housing affordable, incentivize affordable housing development, and allow communities to end homelessness. Any reductions would lead to veterans not receiving the care which they rely on to maintain housing, and these case managers, like Mr. Peck said, are already stretched thin, sometimes caring for far more veterans than clinically indicated. To remove these would be catastrophic to the health, well-being, and housing stability of all the veterans using these vouchers. As such, we insist that they must be used for their intended purpose. Thank you for the opportunity to present this testimony. It's a privilege to work with all of you and your staff to ensure that every veteran facing a housing crisis has access to safe, decent, and affordable housing paired with supportive services. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Monet. And again, thank you all of the panelists for your remarks. I want to now yield to our chairman, Dr. Phil Rowe, 5 minutes for comments and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I have another committee hearing I've got to go to, but I wanted to hear this testimony today because to me, first of all of you are here, thank you for what you do, and thank you for the service to our country. Those of you who served in the military, I very much appreciate that. One of the frustrations I think you have to take a step back is, and I'd like to hear any of you, what is the primary cause, not for just homelessness in general? I think I have a fairly good understanding, but for veterans homelessness, because these are very capable people who were in the military and had responsible jobs in the military. And now they're out and are homeless. And I know there are 3 of us here. Mr. Belarakis is here, and Mr. Kaufman and myself were here 9 years ago when General Shinseki sat there and said we're going to end veterans homelessness by 2016, which I thought was an honorable goal to do and bring the programs to do that. So number one, in veterans, what is the primary cause? Is it relationships? Is it mental health? Is it substance abuse? What is it? And anybody can take a whack at that.
I'll jump in. It's all the above. While combat trauma is the cause in some veterans, military sexual trauma among female veterans who are also committing suicide at an alarming rate. But it's also societal issues. They go into the military perhaps to escape from a disruptive family life, perhaps to escape from gangs, They are in the military for 2 or 3 years, and they come out really with knowing how to shoot a gun or drive a tank. So the transition is very challenging with among those groups that are coming
I
out.
disagree. I think they come out with more skills than that. They learn leadership skills. They learn how to get up early in the morning. They work hard all. Matter of fact, there is no clock when you're in the military. You understand that, and I understand that.
I understand. Yes.
It's
yes.
24/7. So they bring out some very good skills. I think you learn in the military.
Absolutely. They also have, when we were in the military, we knew what we were doing 24 hours a day. It wasn't our responsibility to go out there and determine what happens next, what happens a year from now. So some of them just don't transfer those skills well into the civilian workforce.
A couple of other things, and I have visited the LA campus and what they're doing for the homeless there. So I've made a trip there several months ago. With the job market being at historic lows in our state, we have a state unemployment rate of 3%, and I know California's economy is doing well. How do you attribute this home? And I think this point in time, whether it's up or down a little bit, these point in time are never all that accurate. They're just a guess at how many homeless people there are at any particular point in time. But why do you think in California that the rate's gone up? Are just people moving into California? Is that what it is, or what would be the reason?
There have always been more veterans in California than anywhere else. There are more homeless veterans there than anywhere else. As you said, the unemployment rate is very low. So some of the veterans don't have the skills that they need to. The housing is very high. So they are unable to, at a minimum wage job or even at $15, $18 an hour, able to afford the housing that would take them out of homelessness. So a number of them are staying at our site, in our supportive permanent housing, much longer than they would like to, because they can't afford to move back out into the community.
That's one of the things we found, and even in rural East Tennessee where I live, is a couple things. One, finding housing that's affordable, even where we are, and to get developers to build housing for these that would meet these needs. It's a huge problem for lower income people. And afterwards, I'd love to discuss with you a program we have done at home, beginning at home, that seems to be working pretty well. And I know, not to take all the time, Mr. Martin, you mentioned also something, and we seem to be spending more and more money, but I feel like I'm running in place. You mentioned that, and you're correct, that every community is different, and that El Paso, Texas is different than Northeast Tennessee, where I live. And so I think you were sort of suggesting that you need more flexibility in these grants to be able to do what you need to do. But I'm not sure whether it was just to fill a hole in what your community wasn't doing, or whether you needed the money, just the grant doesn't fit your community.
In direct response to your question, Chairman, it's not necessarily to fill a hole. We have created a foundation under a continuum of care model that was in place until roughly 2009, 2010, when the new Opening Doors initiative came out. And that model was the foundation for what it was we were doing in El Paso and the success that we had in El Paso. And when we had that shift in funding, which was focused more on housing, it took the dollars away from the support services. Because the veterans that we're working with in the Opportunity Center are those that are not VA eligible. And so they have very limited options. And they tend to stay with us. Now, many times they can access SFVF, but because of local requirements that we have, that's limited to 3 months' worth of assistance. And so if we go back to the comments that were just made with regard to a living wage, you can't do that with an entry-level position. So many times it's 3 months and you're out. And then we see that return to homelessness or that recidivism that's going to take place. And that's illustrated in the numbers that I provided to you within the written testimony for our organization. Now, it's too early to tell if that's going to be a trend, but we did see a significant increase in recidivism from 2016 to 2017. And we're also seeing an increase in shelter nights, which is how we gauge services. So that's not unique individuals served. Those are the individuals that come in and take advantage of the shelter because they simply don't have any other options at this point. So it's that support service component that is desperately needed at this point when we talk about case management. Just to give you an example of some of the services that were lost: daycare, legal, transportation, mental health, okay? all of those are those wraparound services that these panelists have indicated that are desired, because we don't need to simply look at placement, we need to look at sustainability, and that's where that flexibility is needed.
My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And I want to thank all of y'all for what you do in a very difficult situation and population, but just thank you for the effort you're putting into that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. For me, just some context, and these are broad questions, but then I think I can drill down, and my colleagues, maybe it will be useful to them as well. But ending homelessness is a very laudable vision. But if we can't measure it, then we won't achieve it. And so my question to each of you, and we'll just go down the line, define ending homelessness as it relates to your organization, and then tell me specifically how you measure the success of achieving that outcome. Just go down the line, start with you, Mr. Clancy.
Yes, sir. So at the TVCA, we don't provide direct support. We don't receive any federal funding for HVRP or any of those programs. So we network with the organizations in our community. What we see that drives the homelessness, or important factor is not unemployment, but underemployment, as was talked about before. So it's almost like when you think about unemployment and you think about the nation, you never get to zero, right? Because there's always some factor in there. When you're at 3% unemployment, you're basically at full employment in the country. And the same thing can be said on the veteran side. And so to say that you're going to get to zero homelessness is probably not an actual achievable goal, because there'll always be folks that, through addiction or mental health, don't take the support that's offered there.
Do you think we're at that functional zero, or do you think it's where there's still ways to?
Well, we've made a tremendous success over the last 9 or 10 years, getting that down. We've captured the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, and getting that down to the to the veterans that really need the help. I've worked, before I took this role, I was the Director of Veteran Services for Easter Seals in Cincinnati, and we did have access to HVRP and HUD-VASH vouchers, and also on the VOC rehab side, educational assistance for veterans. And I can tell you, it's sometimes hard to find those veterans that you can apply those funds to, in the Cincinnati area at least. So what we try to do is get the transition.
Why can't you find the veteran to apply them to?
Well, fortunately, as we talked about before, not every part of the country is the same.
Yeah.
So you have some states that have declared the end of veteran homelessness, and then you have states like Ohio that had a 7% decrease last year in veteran homelessness. The national rate of veteran homelessness went up 1.5%, 568 veterans, but the state of California had 1,800 veterans.
So just back to my original question, I think you're saying that the underlying issue with homelessness, or at least a major underlying issue, is employment, underemployment, and so you would define success as getting veterans a job.
Getting them a job, as well as housing, all those issues combined, but where they're not needing assistance.
Is it housing, or is it the job that allows them to sustain self-sufficiency so that they can have that independence and pay the rent and feel the dignity of all that's involved in that?
That's absolutely right.
So would you define that as success?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let me ask Ms. Williams, because in the interest of time, I need to make it through the panel
Yes,
here.
sir. Quickly,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you. So Easter Seals focuses on employment. And as you just mentioned, when you're able to get someone employment, and then that helps them to be able to sustain housing. So we measure success by how many veterans were able to get employed, and then from there, hopefully to become contributing members of society and to be able to sustain themselves and their families.
Mr. Peck, thank you.
It's four things. Those transitional housing programs that provide the rehab that get them right off the street, the mental health counseling to address their mental health issues, the employment. There's never enough employment training money, ever. And the affordable housing. So you really need those four together.
Okay. In the interest of time, let's just keep going. Mr. Martin.
First and foremost, I'm not overly.
Yeah, but hit your mic if you would.
But I did. My apologies.
No, that's all right.
First and foremost, I'm not overly fond of the term functional zero, because when you look at our veteran population, those that are not VA eligible, a vast majority of those, almost 70%, are over the age of 50. So we look at success as housing sustainability, not necessarily placement, but sustainability and the wraparound services that go with it.
Sustainability as in their ability to sustain their independence and because of employment?
Because of employment and the other related
And
services.
rehabilitation,
And yes,
et
sir,
cetera.
you're
Okay,
absolutely
okay.
correct. Sustainability.
Ms. Monet, and then I'm done.
Yeah, so I think from NTHV's perspective, we really want to look at how communities are building the systems that are making homelessness rare, brief, and non-recurring. And I'm sure you're aware that the federal government does have kind of a set of benchmarks and criteria that they use to assess whether communities actually ended veteran homelessness. But it really looks at, do you know your veterans? Are you making offers of permanent housing? Can you move them into permanent housing within 90 days or less? Are you decreasing unsheltered homelessness, right? Because if you're in a shelter, you still technically count as homeless on the PIC count. So things like that are really how we would look at success.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Monet. My time's expired. I now recognize Ms. Brownlee, Ranking Member VHA, for her remarks and questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank the witnesses today for being here and the work that you do every single day in support of our veterans and addressing this issue of homelessness around the country. Mr. Peck, you had mentioned in your testimony that you were particularly concerned about VA having an intention to rededicate some VASH supportive services funds into the general fund. My understanding in terms of what their intention is, and I will certainly ask the VA when they're up next, but that they were going to take 5% sort of across the board from these funds to provide resources to meet sort of the priorities of the VA, giving those dollars to VISN directors, et cetera, to be able to accomplish those goals. So I want to make sure that we have pulled back from that, but my understanding is that 5%, that would roughly mean about $264 million taken away from supportive services to veterans. So I guess my question really is, you know, what are you hearing on the ground vis-a-vis that? Are you hearing that, you know, these funds are going to be taken away? What do you know?
We're in 11 different locations across the country, so we're hearing different things. Some of the VAs have assured us that those funds will be there. Other VAs have not. As I said in my testimony, we're not getting the case management help we need today when those funds are supposed to be protected. They're supposed to be fenced, used only for VA case managers, and they're not being. So I don't know where they are, and my fear is that if those funds, if the directors have the choice to redirect those funds, that they will redirect those funds to other needs within their community. As I said, the suicide rate among homeless veterans is very, very high, much, much higher than the rest of the population. So, in effect, providing services for these homeless veterans is suicide prevention.
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Do you know what has been said in Los Angeles relative to this issue specifically?
I've spoken to Ann Brown, the director of the West LA VA. She said she will not redirect these funds. We would like to hold her to that.
Very good. In terms of the homeless population in Los Angeles, do you know what percentage are female veterans? At all, roughly?
I don't. It's quite small. It's generally about 3%.
And do they typically have children also?
Some portion of them do. Many of them have lost custody of their children, but some portion of them do, yes. I'm not quite sure what that proportion is, sorry.
And so as far as the case management or lack of case management, Is the problem that the resources aren't there to hire, or is it a problem of just constant churn and turnover? Do you have any sense of that?
Hiring within that bureaucracy is challenging. Sometimes it takes a number of months to do that. But the West LA VA, with the number of VASH vouchers that there are in Los Angeles, has something over 200 social workers. That's really hard to manage. My recommendation is that they spread those contracts out among agencies that are knowledgeable in the community, so that each agency is able to do that job with more oversight, because the oversight now is just not good.
If homelessness in Los Angeles County has risen 57%, and I believe LA has approximately 20% of the homeless veteran population across the country. Do you feel like that Los Angeles is getting the proportionally correct amount of resources distributed across the country?
Los Angeles has been pointed out before for funds, because I think everyone who knows anything about homeless veterans knows that there's an awful lot of homeless veterans there, and more than anywhere else in the country. Whether we are getting the appropriate share, I couldn't tell you. But I think we've got something like 1,500 VASH vouchers, something like that.
Thank you. I realize that my time is up. I yield back. I apologize.
No, I'm a little faster and looser than the chairman over to my left, so well, you're okay. There's gonna be probably a second round here. But great line of questions. Now I would yield 5 minutes to the chairman of the VHA, Mr. Winstrup.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you all for being here and for what you do each and every day and the efforts that you make in trying to help our fellow Americans and those that defended our country. And I became familiar when I came back from Iraq. I wasn't looking for a job. I had a medical practice to go to, but I became very familiar with the work of Easter SEALs in trying to make those matchups, working not only with potential employees, but with employers and trying to make that match. So I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Clancy today, because I have a real geographic bias on where he is, being from Cincinnati, Ohio, and being familiar with the center. I would like if you could just comment for a minute, the relationships that you have been able to build with places like Joseph House and with our Veterans Court, and how that relates to reducing homelessness.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Congressman. The whole purpose of the TVCA, when it was built, was to be the center of collaboration for the hundreds of veteran organizations in the Cincinnati area. So we have built very good relationships. We don't compete with anybody, for the federal dollars. So when we have a veteran in distress that comes through our in-processing center, we can diagnose them and refer them out to all the agencies that are out there, including Easter SEALs. When I was with Easter SEALs, we worked very closely with the TVCA, and we continue to do that now.
And of course, Veterans Court and all those types of things that are trying to get our veterans in a better direction.
Absolutely. We have a very strong Veterans Court in Cincinnati, and at the TVCA we have subgroups on specific issues that we work on: education, employment, health and wellness. And for example, the employment, the education subgroup right now is working with Veterans Court to try to get those veterans that need help access to the GI Bill.
So I know that the center has been pretty robust and a lot of interactions with veterans of all ages, not just recent veterans, but some from previous wars. And we always want to get some lessons learned. And where I want to go with this is Economic Opportunity Committee and Health Committee. And what are you seeing, or what do you think could be done better? We engage in the Transition Assistance Program, which is administered by DOD. Are there things we can do before people take that uniform off that can help them in the long run as far as guidance, counseling, on the track to a profession, rather than VA and what you do being reactive later? What can we do more on the front end?
That's a great point, and that's one of the goals we have. One of the things we strive for is to contact these veterans upstream even as they're separating. We have a program we call Vet Excel, where we work directly with the National Guard, which is big in Cincinnati, the Army National Guard. We work directly with them, with the veterans that are separating, to help them with their resume, the culture change they're going to see from a military unit to a civilian office in terms of everything from the direct feedback you might get in the military that you might not get in the civilian workforce, to even what to wear, the very basics. But we continue to see that underemployment's a big concern. So we help them take the experience they have in the military and be able to change the verbiage or explain properly to a civilian HR department what they're capable of doing. And we have a 2-week program that we do that, bring in the companies. We work with the HR departments directly, we work with the veterans directly, and we try to make that one-on-one match to help that. So it's a combination. We definitely need to be upstream, helping these veterans understand the change that they're about to have.
And being local like that, Guard is a perfect opportunity,
Absolutely.
I think, to do that. What kind of success or results are you having, and what are some of the walls, if you will, in the process?
We're getting great feedback from the companies that we deal with. They love the veterans. I mean, there is no problem in unemployment in Cincinnati. If there's a great opportunity for employment. So they love the veterans because they show up on time, they have a sense of mission, they have a sense of team. And so from the HR perspective, from the company's perspective, we get very great feedback on all the veterans we send their way. And then from the National Guard side, they're very excited about what we're doing because they like that their veterans are hitting the ground running on their civilian side.
And from the veteran themselves, I mean, I'm looking for best practices here. What kind of feedback from the individual veterans themselves?
The individual veterans really appreciate the mentoring that we can give. We're all veteran staff. There's plenty of corporate veterans out there that can be mentors for other veterans coming out of the service. And so one of the best practices we have is having those now civilian, former military successful business men and women mentor the new soldiers coming out of the military.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Winstrup. We'll now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the Economic Opportunity Subcommittee, Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been one of the most helpful panels that has appeared before the House Veterans Affairs Committee in my 5 years here. So I want to thank you all for your testimony and what you've brought to the table today. Some of the takeaways so far for me, Mr. Peck, I think you asked the defining moral question of this committee when you ask, are these lives worth saving? And when you point out that there are 20 veterans a day, every single day in this country, who take their own lives, and the suicide rate amongst homeless veterans is 20 times that of the general population, that should catch everyone's attention and add some urgency to our work on this. So I want to thank you for making it very clear that we are in crisis today. And until we resolve this, we will remain in crisis. And we need to meet that crisis with urgent action. I think many of the panelists, including Mr. Peck and Mr. Martin, make an excellent point that answers the chairman's concern about our fiduciary role for the taxpayer's dollar. If we're not making that 25-to-1 ratio and we're spending all this money to put a roof over a veteran's head, perhaps temporarily, perhaps permanently, but we don't have the wraparound support services, we're not getting the greatest bang for taxpayer dollar, and we're not ensuring that we end some of that chronic homelessness by providing the mental health care, the day care, the transportation services that Mr. Martin talked about. So I think you all made an excellent case for us ensuring that there's accountability and oversight for VA and DOL and HUD, making sure that we fulfill that commitment to 25-to-1. The issue that Mr. Martin alluded to, that many of us on this committee have worked on, which is that we have hundreds of thousands of veterans who have an other than honorable discharge. And what we've been focused on lately is the fact that precludes them from being able to see a mental health care provider. And we have an alarmingly high suicide rate amongst those veterans who have bad paper discharges. We're working on that. I think we're going to get to greater access. But it means that those same veterans are ineligible for the HUD-VASH program, and it consigns them to greater suffering, homelessness, And whether we look at our moral obligation to those veterans who've served this country or just the taxpayer dollars being well spent, I think we have to expand eligibility to include those who have other than honorable discharges. And I want to work with my Republican colleagues, with the VA and the Secretary, with the President on this. I think it's the right thing to do, and we absolutely have to do it. And then the point that many of you brought up about these HUD-VASH dollars being moved to the general fund, that is very alarming. I'm very interested in what the VA has to say on this issue, and I anticipate that question will come from both sides of this committee. Last couple of points. I'm really glad, Mr. Clancy, that you mentioned Combined Arms, one of these outstanding veteran service organizations in Houston. And part of what makes them so exceptional is they take the mindset that the veteran is not a victim, but instead has so much to contribute. And if we can just unleash their potential, the experience, the expertise that they've built in service, by connecting them in some cases with the care that they need and they're not currently getting, the upside for everyone else in society is unlimited. And I'm grateful that you pointed that out. I'll end with this anecdote. The chairman held a really positive field hearing in Lubbock, Texas, on transitioning service members into civilian life successfully. And that morning, we went to Paul's project at Grace Campus. It's a homeless center. And they said about 75% of their clients have some medical connection to their homelessness. Their out-of-pocket expenses were too great. They could no longer pay the mortgage or the rent, or their disability was so significant they could no longer go to work, and they found themselves homeless. Several of you mentioned health care as a connection. I'd ask Mr. Martin, I've got about a minute left, talk about how significant healthcare is as a connection to homelessness, and perhaps how expanding eligibility decreases our homeless population.
In El Paso at the Opportunity Center, we do have one distinct advantage, and that is that we have an on-site health clinic, and it's operated by a separate entity, which is Centro San Vicente. But that access to medical care is a critical component, as well as mental health care, because we also have a community, as it relates to mental health needs overall, that's overwhelmed. And so we've got to look at accessibility as we sort of pick it up. And in the absence of that, what happens is we see a large number of individuals, to use a term that's been used in the past, that self-medicate through alcohol and drugs, and that includes the veteran population. There's just that lack of trust in the system, and that's one thing I haven't heard at this point, especially when we start to get into the older veterans. We have a lot of folks that simply say, I don't want anything to do with the VA. I just want out. And it's distrust, it's disillusionment, whatever the case might be over time. And so that goes back into, to a certain extent, somewhat of a cultural transition. Okay, we've talked about it in terms of employment, but we also have to look at it from a social atmosphere as well. Because in many cases, they elect to be there, and there is a right to have a choice.
Thank you, Ranking Member O'Rourke, and we'll now yield for 5 minutes to Mr. Bilirakis.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions. Stakeholders from our supportive services for veterans families program in my district in Florida, I represent the Tampa Bay, portions of the Tampa Bay area. They've highlighted the need for better coordination between the VA and HUD in strengthening the continuum of care so the veteran homeless populations have the support they need for long-term success. They stress the importance of directing dollars we have provided to the VA towards continuum of care support so the program can focus their efforts on prevention and rehabilitation. So the question is for the panel, the entire panel. We can start with Mr. Clancy. How would you recommend VA, HUD, and the Department of Labor, how could they improve their communication with community partners like those each of you are part of? And I appreciate your testimony today.
Thank you, Congressman.
Again.
In Cincinnati, we have a very good relationship with our VA Medical Center. So we're in very good communication with them constantly. You know, I think there's an advantage to flexibility, and I think as we mentioned before, and so I know there's a concern with with the HUD-VASH program, and the dollars not being specifically directed to them. But again, the Cincinnati, we don't have maybe the needs that maybe Los Angeles has. And I think the flexibility of working with the VA Medical Center is crucial for us, but we have a very good relationship with them.
I will admit this is my third day on the job, so if you don't mind, I would love to submit an answer to you once I get that.
Very good, thank you. And you're doing very well, I tell you that much. So, yes, please.
I think it's important that we look at the entire continuum. There has been a tendency to try to find a single fix. Housing first was the answer for a while, but I think it's critical that we provide those more intensive services that are now done through the grant per diem program at the beginning, so that veterans coming in off the street are getting the services that they need, whether it be mental health or substance abuse or education or whatever it may be, and then have a direct connection between those grant per diem programs and all the permanent housing available, not just HUD-VASH, but also the supportive housing available through the HUD program. And that they cooperate with counties so that the counties are providing a range of services, particularly in regards to mental health and employment that can serve the veterans who are VA eligible and the veterans who are non-VA eligible. So all those systems have to work together.
I had to sort of think a little bit about the response to this question because in our reality, we have a wonderful working relationship with the VA in El Paso. We truly do, and that's through our GPD program. And so we have a lot of interaction that's taking place as we work through that. I think it was a week and a half ago, I sat in on a teleconference call that the VA hosted with regard to coordinated entry, and I think that's one example of what we could use, where we're trying to sort of take two systems and having them use the same entry point. And if you're not familiar with coordinated entry, it can be simply described as one door in. So in other words, everybody goes through a common assessment process. If they qualify for VA, whether it's SFVF, HUD-VASH, whatever the case might be, they go direction 1. If they don't, then they go direction 2, which takes you over to the HUD funding side of the fence, okay? And so that's the intent, to have the two work together. Now, the reality is, when you look at direction 2, we need to start looking at support services, and that could potentially pull in the Department of Labor. Because a lot of the employment side of the fence, employment's one of the keys to sustainability. Desired employment, not just an entry-level job as you work through it. So you've got to take a look at what the strengths of the individual are, and you've got to get away from you must be job ready as the underlying premise, and you've got to start working with that individual and develop the skill sets that are needed, and then 2, to be able to provide the coaching that's necessary for sustainability in employment. So again, it goes back to support services.
Agreed. Please.
So I think this is a really important question, and I appreciate that you all are asking this. I'll tell you that I look at it from two perspectives, and the first is from a top-down approach, right, where all of the agencies are really focusing in on sending coordinated messages and reinforcing the messages of other agencies to their grantees, encouraging people to communicate. I think the other thing to think about in that regard is that the federal government is the largest funder of homelessness assistance, right? So if you can incentivize through your funding mechanisms, coordination, I think you'll be in good shape. The SSVF program does this really well. The Grant Per Diem program is now moving to do that in its current reboot of its system. But I think you also need to look at this from the bottom up and think about what is in it for providers. And coordinated entry, as Mr. Martin mentioned, is one really great approach. I think case conferencing and sharing resources and really creating a solid system in your community is another thing that, you know, is a benefit to a provider and that providers should be thinking about and looking at.
Well, thank you very much, and I see my time has expired. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Submit the rest of the questions for the record. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Mr. Bilirakis. We now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peck, I want to begin by thanking you for the tremendous work that U.S. Vets does in my particular district and the wonderful facility being built with the wraparound services. So I congratulate you on that work. You mentioned in your testimony that there is not a lot of accountability for VA case management and that contracted organizations are held to and achieve greater outcomes. You also said the Inspector General study was unable to identify why veterans exited the program. would a comprehensive study by an entity outside of VA or HUD or like GAO, for example, be helpful in understanding the HUD-VASH's efficacy and where there are still issues in deliverance of services?
Absolutely. I think if we can bring transparency to the goals of the program as opposed to what is actually happening would be invaluable. And I've not seen such a study. That OIG study that I referred to was specific to the the California area. So I think a nationwide study would be excellent to make sure that they're providing the service based on the model that they say it is based on, which is the Housing First model.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make sure that we look at such a study or getting such a study ordered, because it's about the most effective and efficient use of taxpayer resources. And so if we could work with you on that, I'd appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Peck, I want to continue with a line of questioning. In 2016, Riverside County, which I represent, as you know, reached functional zero for veterans' homelessness. But just because there has been some progress in our area, I know that next door in Los Angeles County, which has got a much larger population, they've experienced an uptick, and they have the largest number of homeless. We'll definitely, I think, suffer if we don't, in my area, if we don't address what's going on in Los Angeles. And it doesn't mean we can let up our efforts just because we in Riverside County have achieved functional zero. A continued and coordinated multi-agency strategy is, of course, needed to end veteran homelessness. We have seen in California the number of homeless veterans rise by 20% last year in distinction to what's happened in Riverside County. Now, as a service provider, do you feel that the VA remains committed to ending veteran homelessness?
I should hope so. I think the directors that we deal with at Loma Linda and in Los Angeles are committed to this effort. It frightens me when people talk about the end of the functional end of homelessness. It feels like the problem has been solved, and we have actually experienced talking to funders who are saying, isn't that problem solved? And it is not.
Well, yeah. So here's my thing. I realize that Loma Linda and LA directors, you may feel supportive, but has the Secretary's decision to remove the elimination of veteran homelessness from his top priorities impact the work that you would do on the ground?
It absolutely will impact. If those funds are redirected, the homeless population will go up.
Last year, the VA proposed moving money from specific funds to a general purpose fund. And how would that have impacted the services you provide to veterans and the number of veterans you serve?
It would not only reduce the case management we are getting currently from the VA, it would allow a number of those HUD vouchers to go unused. They cannot be used without the appropriate case management. So it's an overall reduction in service to homeless veterans.
So the HUD vouchers the HUD-VASH vouchers would be unused because we aren't doing the wraparound services as part of the holistic approach that we have to use.
Yes, so the three letters that I've submitted with my written testimony indicate that in some cases they're only using half of the vouchers because the VA cannot commit to providing case management to 100% of the vouchers.
So there's funding on the table that we can't use. Mr. Martin, could you quickly respond to that same question? How would the proposed repurposing of the money affect you on the ground?
Well, when you're talking about VA dollars, like I said, I'm sort of in a different world. And when I talk about the absence of case management, I'm referring to that crisis response system, that safety net, that emergency shelter where we have a large number of individuals. Because in our VA-funded programs, we're able to maintain those levels as we work through that because it's a requirement of doing so. Now, when you look at the VASH vouchers, I believe we have about 294 as a community, and I've not heard any concerns that have come in from the VA in that respect. In direct answer to your question.
I would ask the rest of the panel to submit an answer to that question that I asked in writing later, but Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I'm sorry for going over.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Radewacken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I, too, want to personally commend the panel for not only appearing today, but for doing this very difficult, challenging work. I mean, you're amazing. Mr. Clancy, your testimony suggests that regional veteran collaboratives are part of the solution to ending veteran homelessness. What are those, and why do you think they're needed?
Thank you, ma'am. The veteran collaboratives, as we mentioned, not only here in Cincinnati with the TVCA, but also combined arms in Houston, as the Congressman mentioned, are critical because it enables the community to come together in a collaborative sense to provide the best of services for the veteran. We can combine best practices, different organizations receive different funding, and we can, as best we can, move upstream to get those transitioning veterans before they become in crisis mode.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Radewagen. We'll now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Custer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much. It's a very informative hearing. I think you've taken on kind of a calm tone in what I consider to be a serious change in policy that Congress was not consulted about, and I want to make sure that we get a chance to get to the bottom of what the impact is on a daily basis for our veterans, and not just the veterans that are currently in the system, but perhaps more importantly, the veterans who are not yet in the system or, as you mentioned, have been disillusioned. I wanted to mention Nashua, New Hampshire. We have done tremendous work in my district, particularly Easter Seals. Thank you to Easter Seals, Ms. Williams, and to our own harbor homes. A very effective program integrating healthcare and housing services. I had a wonderful story of a man, John, I met who had been living under a bridge with a group of Vietnam-era veterans. They were, over time, brought in by the social workers, and it turns out part of his problem was a health care issue. He was diabetic and had not been receiving any health care, and when he was housed and got the health care that he needed, come to find out that he had been a middle manager in a company in our area. He had a family that he was estranged from, and over the course of getting the housing and the services, he was able to reunite with his family, and actually now he's a part of helping other veterans. So my question to you is, are there lessons that can be learned, and I'll direct this to Ms. Williams, from the programs that have been effective, and in particular, we've been talking a lot about Los Angeles. If you could turn your attention to rural communities and what more we need to be doing. And then I think in a bipartisan way, we need to take back this discussion from an administration that seems to be turning a blind eye or turning a shoulder toward those veterans in need, and make a decision about fully funding the services that are needed, the wraparound services, the health care, the social workers. So Ms. Williams, if you could talk about the lessons learned and where we go from here.
Thank you so much for the question, and let me speak specifically first, starting with New Hampshire, that New Hampshire does have many rural areas, and with minimal staffing, it's difficult to reach all the veterans in need and to provide the level and attention they need. So that's the experience we're having in New Hampshire. And then secondly, what I would say is that there needs to be greater flexibility to meet the unique needs of veterans, and I just want to again highlight Easter Seals' support of H.R. 4451, which is Congressman Winstrup and Congresswoman Brownlee's bill, because it does in fact allow for that flexibility. Secondly, focusing on retention, helping to maintain jobs and increase employment, and not just any employment, but better jobs is critical. And then the final thing that I would say, which again would tie into what my fellow panelists have discussed, is early access to case management. The community care coordination is vital. That's what we've heard, and I would just encourage the federal agencies and you all to push for that. That is part of how we achieve success.
Could I ask our representative from HUD, do you see the continuum of care as part of the mission to address homelessness from a holistic perspective to not only employment, but I want to remind the chair that some of these veterans are 65, 70, 80. Employment is not the only solution. And if anyone else wants to add in, I have about a minute left. I'd appreciate your comments.
Direct answer on that question. When I look at the population that we serve, over 67% are over the age of 50. And if I take that up a notch and get you to 65 and older, we're looking at, and I just ran the numbers, 18%. Okay, so when we look at our mission under the continuum of care, and our mission statement states this: we transition those that can and we protect those that can't. So you've got to look at that long-term viability for those that are not in a position to seek some type of sustainable housing through employment.
Right.
And that's where you look at the different options.
Thank you. The other question I have is about workforce, and my time is limited, but if you have any comments on workforce or if you want to submit for the record.
I would be more than happy to. I know we're piloting a project right now, which the local university, ourselves, and Workforce, which is based on the premise that anybody can work. But I will submit that in a written format to you. So
I would be very interested in, with the brief indulgence, that veterans be included both on the training side, but also the workforce for social workers and such. So I'd be very interested in any thoughts you might have. And the chair is gone, but I wanted to invite him to New Hampshire for a roundtable on homelessness. Thank you. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Custer. We'll now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel members for attending today. Mr. Chairman, ranking members, I would like to suggest that we see a future panel addressing this crucial issue that would include DOD, because it occurs to me as a veteran myself that our nation invests a great deal of energy and money into training our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to do their job within the military. Largely, soldier in today's military chooses his MOS, and yet we invest virtually nothing prior to their ETS from the military to help them make the transition to civilian life. And all of us know that there's a term in the military called a short timer, 99 and a wake up, etc. It seems to me that if our energies were invested in coordination with the DOD to have sort of an ETS AIT, Advanced Individual Training, to help that military member be prepared for work. Because these men and women that serve our nation, they lose their uniform, they lose their rank, but they maintain their skill, and yet they enter the civilian world as rookies. You have excellent mechanics leaving the military that don't have an ASE certification. They're not qualified to change oil at a dealership. We could fix that if the DOD would work together with the VA and the existing entities that help post-ETS transitions. We have heavy equipment operators operating dozers and cranes and very significant heavy equipments that are not certified to operate a forklift when they get out. Welding certifications, heavy truck driving certifications, nursing and medical profession certifications. All of these excellent skills that are performed by our military members every day across the world, and when they ETS from service, they don't have the civilian certifications that are equivalent to their existent skills. So they lose they lose not just their uniform and their rank, but they lose their opportunity to serve their fellow man with the skills that they have learned and excelled at within the military. As a street cop for 12 years, I've had personal interaction with hundreds of homeless veterans. And I can tell you that there's a sort of an underground culture in existence. And I'd like a couple of you to address this. We say we have 40,000 homeless veterans. We have 184,000 veterans incarcerated in America at an average cost of, a conservative average cost of $32,000 a year per veteran. That's $6 billion. So there's a culture that a veteran, because the very nature of a military veteran is independent and strong and mission-oriented. And they don't expect to be bantered about by civilian housing directors and people of that ilk. So many veterans house themselves in jails. They'll commit they're smart. They'll commit a misdemeanor crime that requires incarceration. They won't make their bond, and they'll do 3, 6 months, 8 months in jail, in a local jail. And then they're back on the street, and they'll live on the street for a while until they repeat that cycle. So I would ask Mr. Peck and Ms. Monet, if the chairman would allow the time, I would ask you to address your consideration regarding a future that we could envision working with DOD to help these military veterans make the transition with the skills that they have in the service to acquire the civilian certification equivalent of their skills so that we don't have this problem.
I think you've hit on a very important problem. That transfer, once a veteran, once a serviceman or woman comes out of the military and hits the street, they do so without appropriate help. The TAP program is there. It's a lot of information in a very short period of time. As you said, once you get to be a short term, you just want out of there. And you don't necessarily want to talk to anybody. So starting a program well before they get out, indicating the possibilities of their possibilities once they get into civilian life, and giving them a connection in the community where they are discharged, so that the VA can contact them and 90 days later, 6 months later, and say, how you doing? Do you have a job? Are you all right? Is your family okay? Just rather than the veteran running out of resources after 6 months or a year or 3 years, and being so disconnected and disillusioned that they won't connect with the VA. So I think that connection is critical, and we have to find a formal system to make that transition.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
Chairman would allow Ms. Monet.
Go ahead, Ms. Monet. Let's make it quick because we're running late already. Ms. Monet, go ahead.
I'll be as quick as I
30
can.
seconds.
So I think from our perspective at NCHV, one of the most interesting things that we do as an organization is we have a toll-free hotline where veterans who are experiencing a housing crisis can actually call in and say, hey, I need help. And I think we've heard from a good number of, young and recently returned vets who have said, I'm getting ready to get out. I have nowhere to go. I live on base housing and I don't even know how to find an apartment. I don't know what that means. And so I think, to your point about DOD getting involved in transition planning, they need to be thinking not only about employment, but, hey, do you have a housing plan? Do you have somewhere to live when you get out? If you don't, can we connect you with VA or a community provider in the area where you're going so that they can help you out and they can sort of wrap some services around you to get you started off on the right foot? I think to the thing that you're talking about with incarceration, any transition planning is important, not only from DOD, but, when you're coming out of jail or prison, or even if you're coming out of mental health treatment or a hospital. I think folks need to really be cognizant that big life transitions are points that are, they're points of vulnerability, I guess, where we could be doing a lot more to improve the services that we give to veterans.
Thank you, Ms. Monet.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the indulgence.
You bet, Mr. Higgins. And now we yield 5 minutes to Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to first of all thank our veterans for your service to our country. and wanted to also echo some of the comments made by my colleagues regarding the redirection of funds without properly notifying Congress. Let's do better next time. A couple of questions. I'll start out. I'm from California, and the question I'm getting asked by a lot of my veterans is, what impact would cannabis use by veterans have on their eligibility to access the various programs, the services that you offer? How are they affected in terms of their eligibility?
That's a tricky one. I know that the VA does not allow cannabis use. There are some verifiable medical uses for marijuana. It is a tricky area because so many of the veterans that we have in our housing have substance abuse issues, addiction issues.
We have an issue of opioid use, abuse.
Yep.
Then we have right now the issue of the famous Cold Memo that has been essentially been repudiated by our Attorney General. Then in the state of California, we do have medical cannabis use. There's a doctor-patient relationship. There's recommendations made by physicians to their patients for use of cannabis. So what we have is a conflict of laws here, state versus federal. And my veterans are asking me what's going to happen if I medicate with cannabis. Will I be affected in terms of my benefits from the VA? And I've gotten conflicting answers, and I'm asking you here publicly because I need to give my vets an answer. And if you don't have the answer now, can I ask you to please submit your answers to me in writing?
I will do. I will
The best
ask,
you can, given
yes.
that I can't answer.
But you're right. There is a conflict between state and federal, and where there is verifiable medical benefit, that should be allowed. So I'll ask all of our clinicians and get back to you.
And Mr. Peck, you talked about more efficient use of funds and unused grant programs, turning them into vouchers. I'm out of Orange County. We have some great folks providing great services, like the Illumination Foundation, a group that's about 10, 15 years old, gets homeless folks, gets them into converted motels, that, gets them on their feet, wraparound services. Is that the kind of services you're talking about in terms of also aiding veterans, in terms of getting them back on their feet?
Absolutely. Nonprofits really have extensive outreach into the communities, much more so than the VA.
And I say that because the only limitation that these folks have is resources.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big proponent for the VA to contract, and I think those dollars would be much more efficient, and we'd reach more veterans.
And let me, with the few seconds I have left, I'm going to follow up on Dr. Weinstrup's and Mr. Higgins' comments about following up with veterans after they take off the uniform in a meaningful way. I mean, it's one thing to give them a survey when you leave, but like just mentioned, some of these vets may be in many ways lacking of the skills they need to survive out there, especially given the invisible wounds they have once they leave the service to our country. So do we have a system to meaningfully follow up with them 6 months, a year, 2 years out, other than a survey or fill out the card and sending it in?
No, there is no such system, and a lot of us are advocating that they have to opt out rather than opt into a program that would allow the VA to contact them after they get
Given that we want to do what's best for the veterans, given that we want to figure out the best way to use taxpayer dollars, I'd rather just follow up with them how the best we can, 6 months out, 1 year, 5 years later. As Mr. Higgins said, we have too many of our veterans in jail today. That's just, there's no excuse for that.
90-day follow-up, 6-month follow-up would save a lot of lives, for sure.
How can we do that? What do we need?
I think my fellow Marine Secretary Mattis would support that, and I'd love someone to talk to him about that.
So can we do something like that? What do we need to get going, folks?
Congressman, if I may, if any veteran that comes through our in-processing center in Cincinnati does get follow-up 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, if we get them a job, we follow up not only with the veteran but with the employer to make sure that everything is going well and the veteran's still squared away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Mr. Correa. We now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to each of you once again for the important work that you do. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for this incredibly important venue today to talk about this important issue. Ms. Monet, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the Housing First model. You said a minute ago, I thought quite profoundly, that Housing First should not ever mean housing only. Multiple times the VA has reiterated its support for Housing First, but I hear from some of the leaders in my district who serve homeless veterans that it doesn't always provide the best option, that it might put a roof over a veteran's head, but it doesn't get to the root underlying problem, such as drug addiction. So could you elaborate a little bit on that, what you mean by that, and talk a little bit more about the Housing First and why it might fall short in some of those cases?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. Thank you for that, sir. So Housing First really means that you're indeed putting someone in housing first, but you're then following up and you're offering services, right? So you're saying, hey, I see you have this issue. Can we help you address your diabetes or your opioid use, or you're unemployed? Do you need a job? Let's get you some employment services. But Housing First, it's very important to make the distinction that your ability to stay in that housing is not predicated on the requirement to access services, right? So you're not requiring them to go to 90 AA meetings in 90 days. You're not requiring them to jump through a bunch of hoops to stay in housing, but what you're really doing is enticing them into the services while they're in housing, because research really has shown that when a person is in housing, they can better address all of the other issues that they're facing.
Very good. As a segue from that, Mr. Peck, you talked a little bit ago about the importance of GPD up front, and I wonder maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that, what you mean by that, and why that would be important.
The case management is more robust in the grant per diem programs, which gives us the opportunity to offer them the rehabilitation that many of them need and are asking for. While Housing First is a good model, it's only one avenue, and I think a number of them would welcome the opportunity to get into a program that could provide the mental health, the substance abuse treatment, the educational opportunities that a GPD program can offer, which a Housing First permanent housing program cannot. There's just simply not the robustness of the case management assistance.
Do you sense that the VA is continuing to support GPD up front? Can you talk a little bit about what we've seen for the posture from the VA from your perspective?
They have supported. Thankfully, they've reduced it somewhat. There's a few thousand beds that they have reduced, and I think those beds may not have been well utilized. They've redesigned the program to make it more proactive. You have to state what kind of service you're going to provide. They really are focusing on outcomes, and the outcomes largely are getting those veterans into permanent housing, whether through the income they earn through employment or a disability income. So they are now, I think, measuring that program better than they were before.
So you're optimistic about the way forward from your perspective. You're not concerned about those changes. Those are good, healthy changes.
Those are good changes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, and I think they will continue to support that. I'm hoping that they will.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate once again all that you do, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Banks. And finally, we'll now yield to Mr. Peters 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all the leadership for holding this hearing and for allowing me to participate, even though this isn't my subcommittee. It's an issue that's very important to me. I represent San Diego, which is the home of a tremendous veterans population. Because of that, the nature of our homeless population is that it's heavy on veterans. We have a lot of programs in San Diego that are community-based. We think are doing well, but obviously they depend so heavily on the federal participation. So let me turn to a couple observations and then ask a couple questions. First of all, we are all very supportive of the interest of the Secretary in suicide, veteran suicide. But we don't want that to come at the expense of housing, because the two are so related. What we've heard from all of you is that suicide rates among the homeless veterans are much higher. So keeping them housed and off the streets and dealing with housing is, in effect, part of the suicide battle as well. And we certainly urge the Secretary to keep that in mind as he talks about where he spends money and shifts money. The other observation I would make that a lot of my colleagues have made is the importance of the Department of Defense in this. The most cost-effective expenditure of American taxpayer money is to really prepare transitioning vets to come out and be productive, be employed, have a plan, And I think that we may want to ask more of the Department of Defense to take that on as one of their tasks. They train great warriors. They train them to have the skills I think that the chairman had, but they're not necessarily trained to deal with civilian life in a way that they could be, and they should be at the time of transition. And Mr. Clancy's talked about some of the efforts that he's done in his area on that. I think I commend that. Maybe you know of 0800 in San Diego, which is a transitioning program that tries to do the same thing. Go on the base at the time of transition and introduce the community at that point, so that when people walk off the base as civilians, they're not strangers to that. Mr. Clancy?
Yeah, absolutely. San Diego has a great program, and it's in my written testimony, but I didn't mention it today. But the San Diego Veteran Coalition and Military Family Collaborative is a group that we, as the Combined Arms, we have conference calls with them, best practices, what are they doing that's successful, what are we doing that's successful. And so there are a number of collaboratives around the country that are working together to again, learn from each other and learn how best to prepare the veteran for separation from the military.
Terrific, and I certainly think it's worth observing that even if the VA and the Veterans Committee were functioning at 100%, we couldn't replace the importance of community involvement. That's something we can't do as a government. Not every solution comes from the government. I think with community involvement has been so helpful. In the time I have, though, the question I wanted to ask was about vouchers. In San Diego, we get reports that there's a large number of vouchers that aren't used. And I would like to just, maybe Mr. Peck, you could address, how is that possible? Why does that happen? And maybe what could we do to make sure that the resources that we do have are being employed to make sure that veterans have housing?
In some instances, unfortunately, it's due to high housing costs, which I'm sure is true in San Diego. And I've worked closely with the VVSD down there. Mm-hmm. A really good program. Some landlords are not taking those vouchers. I know in Los Angeles, 500 veterans are walking around with vouchers in hand that cannot find housing. So they stay in bridge programs like the ones we run and others. Creating the affordable housing, talking with landlords is critical to be able to get those veterans into their housing. And additionally, a shortage of VA social workers is contributing to those vouchers not being used.
So the work with landlords is more a local issue.
Yes, it is critical that there's a local plan for each of these federal issues. As you said, the community-based nonprofits are the ones that know and are familiar with the community.
As a federal lawmaker, what would you suggest I do to see that more vouchers were used in San Diego, given our high housing costs? Mr. Peck?
I would, two things need to be done. Check with the VA to make sure that they are providing the appropriate number of case managers. And two, talk with the city who can talk to the landlords. This is what's happening in Los Angeles in an effort to get them to look more closely at these vouchers, and we have housing locators to reach out to those landlords.
And on our end, I think the case managers is the answer. We have to make sure that that support system is provided as well.
Absolutely.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. And I would like to say, as the chair of the Subcommittee for Economic Opportunity, that I associate myself with much of what you said and of what my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have said, which is what I love the most about this committee. I mean, we just somehow, when you walk through these doors and when you're thinking about the customer, which is the veteran, you just put everything aside and you do everything you can to put America and our veterans first. And I appreciate the candor and thoughtful responses from our panelists, and I appreciate your service to our veterans and our country in that regard. One final comment before we conclude and then have the next panel join us is that as an economic opportunity subcommittee that oversees the transitional assistance program, and I think the comments were made repeatedly about sort of the ounce of prevention and transition, the assessment holistically of the veteran. or the serviceman or woman coming out of active duty into civilian life. And all that we do to invest and time and resources to prepare these good Americans to defend us and our freedom and our allies, all that we do to prepare them to be warriors, and in my opinion, how little we invest to transition them so that, quite frankly, we don't need much of your services because we've done a good job on the front end, and we've made it as much of a priority to transition them and assimilate them back into civilian and to tap those skills that they've learned and those responsibilities that they've had. And we have rehabilitated where there's been trauma in their experiences. So I hope in the next year, and this is something I've made known to my colleagues who are staffing the committee, I want reform of the TAP program to be of the first and foremost priority for our committee. And after some of the hearings we had on TAP, we know how much money we spend. We don't know what outcomes. They didn't have much to any outcome. Could be that they're doing a good job. I have a sense from talking, listening to you and talking to folks back in my district that we can do a whole lot better. So I hope we can commit to transforming that program to really work on the front end, and so we have less drug addiction, less suicide, less homelessness and joblessness from our heroes on account of a program that actually works. Maybe it is working. I don't know. There really wasn't much data to suggest it was, so a lot of this is just intuition. Thank you, guys. You're dismissed, and we would ask that the second panel come and join us so I can introduce you and we can get on with the second panel and the discussion. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and make the introductions of our panelists. Joining us now this afternoon is Matt Miller, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Veterans Employment and Training Service of the U.S. Department of Labor. And we have alongside of him Dominique Blom, the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Public and Indian Housing of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and also Dr. Thomas Lynch, the Deputy Undersecretary for Health and Clinical Operations for the Veterans Health Administration of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, who is accompanied by Dr. Keith Harris, the Director of Clinical Operations for the Homeless Program Office. We thank you for joining us, and Mr. Miller, let's start with you. You have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Winstrup and Arrington, Ranking Members Brownlee and O'Rourke, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to provide a statement for today's hearings on veterans homelessness. As a former Chief of Staff in this body, I want to personally recognize you and committee staff for their tireless efforts to ensure that America fulfills its obligations to our current service members, veterans, and their families. My name is Matt Miller, and I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the United States Department of Labor's Veterans Employment and Training Service, or VETS. I'm also the department's representative on the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. Secretary Acosta stands firmly behind our country's service members and veterans. He has a clear goal that will assist our veterans in finding and keeping good jobs. For the department, one veteran experiencing homelessness is one too many. We look forward to working with the subcommittees and providing those who served our nation with the employment, support, assistance, and opportunities they deserve to succeed in the civilian workforce. Our partnerships throughout DOL extend VET's ability to achieve its mission and bring all of DOL's resources to bear for America's veterans. One important component of VET's mission is the Homeless Veterans Reintegration Program, or HVRP, which provides grants to organizations to assist in reintegrating homeless veterans into meaningful employment. Grantees also provide wraparound services to link homeless veterans with health care and housing opportunities provided by our partners. While HVRP is like a canoe compared to the carrier-sized programs that the VA and HUD offer, it serves a critical mission in ending homelessness among veterans. Each HVRP participant receives customized employment and training service such as occupational, classroom, and on-the-job training to address his or her specific barriers to employment. The HVRP program succeeds because of the hard work and local connections of our grantees like U.S. Vets, but also because of the collaborative efforts of our government partners at the federal and state levels. 2 weeks ago, I had the humbling experience of touring one of our grantees located along Skid Row in Los Angeles, California. While there, I heard about Jeremy, an honorably discharged Marine Corps veteran. He had been incarcerated for 7 years and began working with our grantee, Volunteers of America. Jeremy's counselor worked with him to develop a career plan, and within 4 days of enrolling in the program, Jeremy got a job at the SoCal Construction Company, and since starting, his wages have increased from $12 to $14 an hour. In FY 2017, the HVRP program received an appropriation of $45 million that provided services to over 16,000 homeless veterans with a placement rate of 67% and an average salary of $12.88 an hour. The fastest growing segment of the veteran population are women. HVRP funds are used to serve them, along with veterans with families and incarcerated veterans. We also support stand-down events where we partner with federal and state agencies, local businesses, and social service providers to offer critical services to homeless veterans. Additionally, to assist with the Hurricane Harvey relief effort, vets awarded $50,000 for 3 stand-down events in Houston, Texas, serving a total of 756 homeless veterans. I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to highlight a significant challenge we face, the statutory definition of homeless veteran. If Jeremy, who I mentioned earlier, had first received permanent housing from one of our counterparts at 11:59 p.m. on Monday, he would not be eligible to apply for our programs at 12:01 a.m. on Tuesday, and thus not able to take advantage of our employment services. Studies have shown that barriers to employment still exist after immediate housing needs are met, and individuals still run a risk of becoming homeless again. VET's 2016 annual report to Congress proposes a solution to this, and I'd like to work with you to further discuss how we can rectify this problem. Chairman Winstrup and Arrington, Ranking Members Brownlee and O'Rourke, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, the Department of Labor is committed to the goal of ending veterans' homelessness, and we look forward to working with you, our federal partners, and the Interagency Council to ensure the continued success of our efforts. This concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We now yield 5 minutes to Ms. Blum.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to you, Chairman Arrington, Chairman Winstrup, Ranking Member Brownlee, and Ranking Member O'Rourke, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the efforts of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and our federal partners for ending veterans' homelessness. I am Dominique Blum, a career senior executive and the General Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Public and Indian Housing at HUD. My office is responsible for the HUD-VASH program. HUD is committed to working towards the goal of ending veterans' homelessness with our federal and local partners by maximizing our collective resources. Thanks to funding from Congress and this collaborative partnership, we have made remarkable progress. HUD's general homeless programs run by HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development provide about $2.4 billion annually to help homelessness primarily through permanent supportive housing. 97 million of these funds serve approximately 17,000 veterans through the Continuum of Care program, including 10,000 veterans with disabilities. Thousands more veterans are served with rapid rehousing, emergency shelter, and other assistance. My office administers the HUD-VASH program, which combines housing choice voucher rental assistance provided from HUD with case management and clinical services provided by the VA. This program is one of our most effective tools at reducing veterans' homelessness. Since 2008, over 131,000 veterans and their families have used a HUD-VASH voucher to move into stable housing, and as of September, over 77,000 veterans were housed through HUD-VASH. Shortly, HUD will be awarding approximately 5,500 new HUD-VASH vouchers, with the additional $40 million that was appropriated last year. Although we've seen incredible results through the program, we continue to make changes to address local needs. First, HUD is changing the distribution of homeless veterans. Between HUD and the VA plan to develop a process to recapture unused HUD-VASH vouchers and reallocate them to high-need cities. Second, we have awarded 4,700 VASH vouchers as project-based vouchers, allowing for the development of affordable housing in high-cost areas. Third, we are encouraging public housing authorities to project-base their existing HUD-VASH vouchers, which was made easier through the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act of 2016. These efforts demonstrate our commitment to optimizing the effectiveness of HUD-VASH while also allowing for local flexibility in addressing homeless veterans population. Building on the success of HUD-VASH, Congress appropriated $5.9 million in 2015 for the Tribal HUD pilot program to begin addressing veterans' homelessness in Indian country. As of last week, 299 Native American veterans were receiving case management, and of those, 234 were already housed under the program. One of the lessons learned from the Tribal HUD-VASH demonstration and the Indian Housing Needs Study is that homelessness looks different in Indian country. As tribes face severe housing shortages, close family ties often result in overcrowding as families live with other families. The Tribal HUD-VASH program has become instrumental in getting entire families into appropriately sized homes. When Army Infantry Specialist Jeremiah Miguel of the Tonoadom Nation returned to his reservation in Arizona, he found himself sharing one room with his girlfriend and 6 children. But after receiving a HUD-VASH voucher, his family now lives in a 4-bedroom apartment. While most communities across the country showed a decline in veterans' homelessness, sharp increases were in a few areas with extremely high housing cost needs, and that led to the overall increase. Based on the 2017 point-in-time count, veterans' homelessness increased by 1.5% between 2016 and 17. But the larger story here is that veterans' homelessness has declined by a historic 46% since 2010, and the results are largely due to the success of the HUD-VASH program, perhaps one of the best examples of federal partnership. Together, HUD and the VA and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness have implemented a joint decision-making structure to administer the programs and policies related to HUD veterans' homelessness. We've also jointly created a set of standards to evaluate whether communities have ended homelessness, and since 2014, more than 880 state and local officials have set the goal of ending veterans' homelessness, and as of January 11th, 60 communities across 30 states have achieved this goal. This is an amazing accomplishment. In conclusion, we must continue to find ways to maximize the effectiveness of HUD-VASH program and to continue to work collaboratively to bring critical housing and health resources to veterans, while also assisting communities in utilizing all available homelessness assistance resources. Thank you very much for facilitating this work, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Blum. Dr. Lynch, you now have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Wenzel, members and members of the subcommittees. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the VA's commitment to ending homelessness among veterans. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Keith Harris, who is Director of Clinical Operations for VA's Homeless Programs Office. Let me state up front, VA remains committed to ending veteran homelessness and is working in close collaboration with our partners to ensure that veterans have permanent, sustainable housing with access to high-quality health care and other supportive services. VA and our partners at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness have developed systematic protocols for ending veteran homelessness, which include the identification of all veterans experiencing homelessness, the ability to provide shelter immediately, and the capacity to help veterans swiftly move into permanent housing. The number of veterans experiencing homelessness in the United States has declined by nearly 1/2 since 2010. This is an unprecedented decline, both as it relates to ending homelessness in this country and in comparison to other public health efforts. To date, 60 communities across 30 states have achieved the goal of effectively ending veteran homelessness. Over 600,000 veterans and their family members have been assured housing through HUD's targeted vouchers and VA's homeless programs. VA has dramatically increased the number of services available to veterans that focus on housing, clinical care, and social services, as well as resources aimed at preventing homelessness. Overall, the message is positive and important. Communities, in partnership with VA, are preventing and reducing veteran homelessness. Recently, VA proposed a reallocation of specific purpose to general purpose funding. This shift did include funding in support of the HUD-VASH program. The goal was to give facilities greater flexibility in the effective use of their budget to reduce homelessness, reflecting local variations in the use of resources. This unfortunately resulted in unnecessary confusion. Please be assured that our commitment to veteran homelessness remains unchanged. There will be no change in funding to support our homeless programs until we solicit further input from our congressional colleagues, our external stakeholders, and local VA leaders. Over the next several months, VA will engage in a formal interagency process to solicit further input to ensure that any realignment of funds best supports our nation's veterans. VA's way forward is to work with federal partners to implement our interagency strategic plan to end veteran homelessness. Important objectives include enhancing integrated services for homeless veterans struggling with suicide risk and substance abuse, addressing high-need communities by recapturing and reallocating available resources, emphasizing efforts to improve employment outcomes, and fully committing to coordinated entry efforts in local communities. To expand on these objectives, 57% of veterans who are at risk of homelessness or are currently homeless have a mental health diagnosis, and 46% have a substance use disorder. Our homeless program is working closely with our mental health and suicide prevention offices to respond to these clinical priorities. VA's efforts must comprehensively be linked to all community efforts as well. We heard this in the first panel. One size does not fit all when it comes to ending homelessness. All VA medical centers are now required to work with their local communities to develop and operate a coordinated entry center and system for all homeless individuals, including veterans. This ensures coordination of community-wide services for veterans experiencing homelessness, system-wide awareness of available housing and services, and easy access to and appropriate prioritization for these resources. After 6 years of consistent progress, HUD's 2017 point-in-time count shows a continued decline in homelessness in most communities, but stalled progress in others due largely to high rent and low vacancy rates. We are continuing to promote development of affordable and permanent supportive housing and are working with all partners to encourage efforts aimed at financing and developing additional housing stock. When veterans are at risk for homelessness, VA and its federal, state, and community partners must work together to rapidly connect them with appropriate assistance to provide housing stability. Sustaining the momentum and preserving the gains made so far requires continued attention, collaboration, and investment of financial resources. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. My colleague and I are prepared to answer any questions.
Thank the panelists for their remarks. We're going to go in reverse order. Mr. Higgins, you're prepared to ask questions. I'm going to defer to you for 5 minutes. The gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panelists for appearing today regarding this crucial issue that challenges our nation. Mr. Miller, I particularly would like to ask you, sir, and I thank you and Secretary Acosta for your dedication to the Department of Labor. To what extent does the DOL and Veterans Affairs coordinate homelessness programs? like job training to prevent unnecessary duplicative process. I'm particularly asking because one of our challenges, as we've heard today from both panels, is funding. And in the effort to protect the people's treasure and yet provide the needed services for our veterans, we're duty bound to find areas where there are duplicative services that may not be necessary. So to what extent does the DOL and the VA coordinate programs, and are there similar programs operated by DOL and VA that absolutely need to be operated separately? Would you address that, Mr. Miller?
Well, Congressman, of course, as I stated in my testimony or oral statement, we do a collaborative effort very much so with the VA, with HUD, with FEMA, with other organizations, as well as the U.S. Intercouncil on Homelessness. But when a grantee for an HVRP program puts forth a application, one of the things that they have to have in an application is a strategy of how they're going to work with agencies such as the VA and HUD and overcome housing and healthcare needs of the individual. We use things such as the VA Supportive Services for Veterans Families that's encouraged, the VA's Grant Per Diem program, HUD's Veteran Affairs, Supportive Housing, the HUD-VASH program that was mentioned, or Continuing of Care. In addition to you mentioned about the federal level, but we also work with states and local levels to do that as well as our grantees. You know, we provided about $45 million for grantees all over the country, nationwide in both rural and urban settings for about 155 grantees all over the country. And we also urge them to work together. I mean, that's what makes our program such a success, is the collaborative efforts between our grantees and our partners.
Thank you for that very thorough response. And shift gears in the remaining time regarding the services provided for incarcerated veterans. It's a good program. How is funding and staffing for that? Are you able to touch the local, state, and federal jails where veterans are incarcerated and provide these services? Just give the committee, please, an overview of where you are on that program.
Well, yes, sir. We provide actually an incarcerated veterans transition program that we use, where we provide grants to incarcerated population. Fortunately, we are aware that this could be duplicative of what exists in states as well as correctional Department of Corrections within states. So that's something that we take into consideration, but we do provide grants for folks to go in and work with incarcerated veterans.
Thank you again for that answer. I yield the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. We now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling on this end of the bench. It's a little bit like Christmas in January. Appreciate that. I had some questions for Ms. Blom, if I could, about the HUD vouchers. I think you heard the comments I made before to the previous panel. Are there any actions that HUD is taking to address the mortgage and rental cost disparities in high-cost markets with the HUD-VASH voucher program?
Yes. So thank you very much for the question. We definitely have seen, particularly in West Coast cities, those in California as well as in Seattle, that there has been an increase in veterans homelessness, largely driven by decrease of affordable housing and high costs of living in those cities. So we've recognized this. We do believe that there are some potential solutions here. First, we believe that it's important for housing authorities to be working with their partners to project base these vouchers. Right. And now VASH vouchers can be used as project basing and made much easier as a result of changes Congress made in 2016. And we will continue to encourage the project basing of these vouchers so that there's a development of affordable housing and that it's available long-term for veterans. Secondly, we're also changing and allowing housing authorities flexibility for their payment standards, so they can go above a certain amount that HUD generally provides for housing, going above that in these high-cost areas. And then third, we are also encouraging that housing authorities provide additional landlord outreach, finding those landlords that will be more willing to serve veterans.
And I know there's a cap on the project-based vouchers of 20%. Is that something you're considering raising, or if not, why not?
So just in the last 2 years, HUD now has the flexibility to allow housing authorities to go above that 20% cap. So HUD VASH vouchers are part of that pool of vouchers that housing authorities now can project-base without any need for approval from the department.
So that decision's made at the local level?
Yes, that is.
Okay, great. Can you tell me how the HUD VASH vouchers expire in 120 days? Have you ever considered extending that?
When we say that it expires for that particular service member.
Right.
That voucher then would go back to the housing authority, and that housing authority, once it receives a referral from VA, would be able to reissue that voucher. But I think what you're asking, is there a possibility to extend the 120-day period for that particular veteran? We'll look into that and see if that's possible.
And I understand there might be a reason to do that. You want to put some urgency behind it, but of course in a tough market, it may present different circumstances. I don't know.
Precisely. We'll
Are you satisfied that that local agencies are taking advantage of this flexibility about project-basing vouchers? And if not, is there a way that we can help them understand the benefit of that?
Mm-hmm. So I think particularly in LA, we're going to have concentrated efforts occurring there. We were a little taken aback by the increase in the point-in-time count for veterans homelessness in LA. We know we need to do concentrated outreach to the housing authorities in the LA region to talk about targeted ways that we can be increasing the success rate of VASH vouchers there. And project basing is certainly one of those solutions.
Okay. I really appreciate the testimony. Thanks for being here, and we want to encourage your continued attention to housing the veterans that we have on the streets, and we'll look forward to working with you on that.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, now yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. We now yield 5 minutes to our Health Committee Subcommittee Chair, Mr. Brad Winstrom.
Dr. Lynch, question for you. How many veterans getting out of DOD are homeless within the first 5 years or so?
I honestly don't have the answer to that. Keith, do you have a quick estimate?
I don't have an estimate, but we have a work group that works with DOD, VBA, and others looking at the transitioning service members from DOD and following them down to VA and assessing homeless rates, but we're very early in that process.
So you are in the process, because I think it's a key number to figure out, right? What is the problem here? You know, why does this occur? It kind of reminds me of you see situations of a child who presents to the emergency room every 3 weeks or so with a cough. You treat the cough, and they get a little better, and 3 weeks later they're back with the same cough. At some point, you want to go into the home and figure out why they're getting the cough, and that's where you find that there's a mold growing or whatever the case may be. So this is important information, especially because it's current and it's now. So this goes back to what we want to do or consider doing in the transition process. So if the majority of people are homeless within the first 3 years, you know, why did that happen? What was missing from when they left that we can get them on the right track before they even take off the uniform? So I hope that this is something, and you can affirm this or not, that you are definitely trying to track as best you possibly can. I know that sometimes those numbers are hard to track people when they leave, but as best you can, I hope that that's the process taking place.
And can I just make a couple of follow-up statements?
Sure.
I think, number one, it really emphasizes the importance of prevention, which is a process that our homeless program is really focusing on now. Two aspects of that. One, preventing veterans going back into homelessness, and second, preventing veterans getting into homelessness. Mm-hmm. Secondly, I'd just like to emphasize that we've initiated 2 programs now, initially focused on suicide prevention, but easily converted if there's an opportunity. One is called Concierge for Care, where we're actually reaching out to veterans after they transition, offering them help in terms of completing the enrollment process, and offering them the opportunity to schedule an appointment at their VA.
So,
The President's recent executive order also focused on the transitioning service member, and that's going to begin taking a look at how we begin to provide services to that transitioning service member, and also how we begin to integrate with DOD, which is another point that's come out throughout this hearing.
it's what we're interested in, as you can tell, is moving that timeline. Okay, not till after the problem exists, but how can we get there before it exists to make sure that it doesn't? And so my question is, do you have, at this point, do you have walls in front of you from DOD or whoever, or whatever the case may be, something we need to fix here? Are there obstacles in your way to achieving that goal of getting as close as you can to the veteran as soon as you can?
I think we are in a position now, probably better than we have ever been, to collaborate with DOD and begin to look at how we provide services to the transitioning service member and begin to address problems, whether it's suicide prevention or homelessness, before we get to the critical position, but treat them earlier before they get to homelessness or suicide risk.
So can you describe the relationship that's starting to form then between VA and DOD?
We have recently recruited within our suicide prevention program Dr. Keita Franklin, who comes directly from DOD and is going to be helping us reach out and collaborate with DOD and integrate the programs that both VA and DOD have.
And just real quick, it's been said in your testimony that some communities have zero homelessness or net zero homelessness. So what does that mean for the future? Does that mean we don't need to do anything more in those communities? Or is this, in your opinion, a constant light that needs to be on?
I think it gets back to the whole issue of zero homelessness. I don't think we're going to get there because I think it's a continuing problem. We have to continue to be on the alert for homeless veterans. We have to be able to provide them immediate shelter, whether that's transitional housing or permanent housing, and we have to provide them the wraparound support that keeps them in housing and keeps them from going back to homelessness. I think it's an ongoing effort.
Thank you. I yield back. Thank
you, Mr. Chairman. Now yield 5 minutes to my ranking member and friend Beto O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Lynch, a couple of the witnesses on the previous panel, including Mr. Martin from El Paso, mentioned case manager to client ratios that are way out of whack from best practices. If it should be 1 to 25, Mr. Martin mentioned El Paso, he may have 1 to 200, 1 to 250. What's the answer to that? Who's responsible, and how do we get that back down to a manageable level? You just mentioned, you ended your answer to Dr. Wenstrup by talking about the importance of wraparound services. So how do we make sure that we're following through on that?
I think what was apparent to me when I listened to the first panel was that there is no correct answer. There are unique opportunities in every community, and
should we be at 1 to 25?
I think I don't know what the right
debate?
ratio is, Congressman. I think we need to understand the community. We need to understand the veteran. Some veterans may, in fact, need greater support than other veterans.
So if we don't have a benchmark, then I don't know what to measure against, and I don't, give me a little bit of context. I feel like they made a very good case that having active case management improves the likelihood that a veteran's going to transition out of homelessness. You seem to dispute that there may be a benchmark.
I don't think I'm disputing the need for case management. I think I'm saying that trying to put a number on it is a difficult thing.
If you don't put a number on it, we can never measure it. We'll never know how
because veterans
you're doing.
are individual.
We'll never put the resources to
and
it.
some veterans may actually need greater support. And as veterans become more acclimated to home and to employment and to community, they may need less support.
Okay. Well, I would love a better answer from you and the VA, and so I'll submit that for the record, and I hope you can get me back something that we can measure and act upon. Otherwise, we're just taking subjective measurement, or it's different in each case, and I don't know that we're going to get the resources to those community providers who are telling us, you just heard them right now, saying that they don't have what they need to take care of these veterans and improve their chances of escaping homelessness and living to their full potential. I'm going to switch to a different subject. Many of the panelists also mentioned the connection to access to health care. There was a recent announcement by the President and the Secretary of the VA about improved access to mental health care. I want to ask you, does that specifically include veterans who have an other than honorable discharge? And by extension, will that allow those veterans who have a bad paper discharge to access the HUD-VASH voucher program, which today they cannot?
Right now, we are aiming to try to focus on every veteran who is transitioning. Right now, we can address about 40% of them because of eligibility. We're going to need to explore the issue of other than honorable and dishonorable and how we're going to address those veterans. I think there is an opportunity working with HUD to give vouchers to veterans with other than honorable discharge because we can work with the community to provide the wraparound services. We also, I believe, have the opportunity to work with SSVF to provide care for veterans who may receive other than honorable discharge.
Okay, and I just want to make sure that I nail down the specifics in your answer. Will veterans who have an other than honorable discharge be eligible for the HUD-VASH voucher program?
Ms. Blum, do you want to?
Yes, thank you. I can address that. We have had a partnership with VA to start piloting a program to have a portion of those HUD-VASH vouchers serve other than honorable discharge members. And this is decided on the local level with the VA Medical Center, as well as a continuum of care partner that provides then those wraparound services, the case management, and then that referral has come to the local public housing authority. We today have 2 housing authorities and localities that are participating in this pilot, and we're hoping to expand it in the future.
How many veterans who have an other than honorable discharge status are participating in this program, in this pilot program?
I'll be able to get that information back to you after this hearing.
Okay, I appreciate that. And
Congressman, would you mind if Dr. Harris just commented briefly on El Paso? And
not at all. Yeah, please.
I appreciate the question about the staffing and understand the concerns about that. And I don't want to speak for the prior panelist, but I don't believe he was speaking about the HUD-VASH program and speaking about a 200-to-1 ratio that does not exist in our program. The positions are funded on roughly a model of 1 to 25. Medical centers do have some leeway within that. Instead of hiring 1 GS-12 social worker, they might hire 2 peers, for instance, at GS-6, something like that. El Paso is actually at 100% staffing. It's one of the rare medical centers that is. So staffing is not a challenge there. Their vouchers are reasonably well utilized as well.
So the point that I took from that, and I'll cede to the chair, is that there are not enough resources dedicated to support services, which includes funding the appropriate case manager to client ratio, and it's making it harder for those providers to extend mental health care, transportation, family care to their clients that in turn helps them to transition out of homelessness. So if I'm using the wrong nomenclature or the wrong measure, let me know. I just want to resolve the discrepancy between you saying we've got everything filled and John Martin saying we're at 1 to 250. It's somewhere there's a breakdown, and I'd love to find out who's responsible, not to punish them, but to make sure that we get the resources to those who are providing the care in the community where there's a gap right now. So, and I just want to thank the previous panel for hanging out. It looks like we're going to wrap this one up soon. The fact that we're all in the same room, maybe we can quickly get together and resolve what the discrepancy is and come up with a solution for El Paso and some of these other communities. So I'll yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank the ranking member, and that's an excellent line of questioning. I will yield 5 minutes now to the other ranking member for the Health Committee, Ms. Brownlee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Lynch, for stating on the record that there will be no VASH funding transferred to general purpose funds.
Can I also just add the corollary that the Secretary is committed to getting input not only from our federal partners, but also from our community partners as well, and our stakeholders. I think this program is now 10 years old, and I think it's time that we need to have a critical reevaluation. And I think what I took from the first panel was the fact that there are different ways to manage problems in different communities. We need to hear that, we need to understand it, and we need to figure out how we adapt our programs to be more effective.
I couldn't agree more, and I welcome that interaction with our community partners, and hope to have the discussion here as well. So, but thank you for stating that on the record, because I think that people were concerned that that was happening today. So, anyway, I wanted to go back. We've been talking a lot about the HUD-VASH vouchers. I represent a little bit of Los Angeles County, but I represent all of Ventura County. And we have the issue of expensive housing. That's an issue for us. What another issue has been is that our housing authority in the city of Ventura has been told by the VA that the vouchers can only, they have some outstanding vouchers. And right now, I think the city of Ventura is only using 67% of the vouchers that are allocated to them, or the funding allocated to them. So, so what the VA has been telling them is that those vouchers can only go to chronically homeless veterans. And you know, I want to know whether that's true or not. I mean, if it is true, you know, to be chronically homeless, you have to be, you know, out on the street for a long period of time. It's almost like you have to be on the street for a year before you could even qualify to be chronically homeless, at least based on my understanding of that definition. So could you speak to that?
I'm going to ask Dr. Harris to speak for VA to begin with.
Sure. And unlike the last question, we do concur on the numbers here. Our number is 70% utilization, but it's clear that utilization is low in Ventura County, and part of that is a result of lower staffing in that area than we would like, and there's aggressive efforts right now to recruit for that. In terms of the question about chronic homelessness, it is true that HUD-VASH is targeted to the chronically homeless population. That's the population that most needs that kind of intensive support. It is not true that vouchers can only be allocated or given to chronically homeless. That's a message we need to correct with that medical center, and we will.
Well, we don't have a medical center in the county of Ventura, but
Sorry, Greater LA, and then through
okay,
that.
very
With
good.
the supervisory chain is what I mean.
Okay, very good, very good. So I think clearing that up will be very, very helpful. So, and I do, you know, applaud Ms. Bloom what you're talking about in terms of using the vouchers or unused vouchers for project-based projects as well as high-need areas. I think that you know, providing that flexibility is very good. But I want to make sure that in a county like Ventura County that they can utilize their vouchers because the need is there before they would give up those vouchers to another area. But I wanted to follow up on Mr. Peters' line of questioning with the project-based opportunities. He was saying it's capped at 20%, but you're saying that that's eliminated, so a local housing authority, local government can decide, no, we want to use all of our vouchers for a project-based?
Housing authorities can use all of their HUD-VASH vouchers for project basing. There is no longer a cap on that measure. So housing authorities
and
have
that information is out to housing authorities across the country?
We believe it is, but
Okay.
if you have specific instances where you believe we haven't communicated that, we're happy to reinforce
Well,
that
it's
point.
the first I heard it today, so I will certainly check in with our housing authorities to see if they understand that. And in terms of homelessness in high-cost areas, so has there been any conversations about raising the level of the voucher so it can be competitive in these expensive marketplaces?
Yes, we have been talking about that. We currently allow housing authorities to go up to what we call 110% of the payment standard, and where housing authorities believe they need even more flexibility to go above that, we will consider that on a case-by-case basis. And I think housing authorities in these high-need, high-cost areas would be able to make a compelling argument for that.
And is there anything new coming forward in terms of addressing suicide, but particularly for female veteran suicide, which we know is it's 20 times higher than the rate of suicide attempts. Excuse me. The suicide rate amongst women veterans is exponentially higher than suicides amongst civilian women. And is there anything new in terms of trying to address homelessness for women and certainly homelessness for women and their children? Any new opportunities? I know I have a bill. There are other bills out there, but is HUD looking at other opportunities?
So at this point, the department hasn't targeted an additional population specifically to focus on, and our current areas of focus don't include women veterans at this point. But just recently, there had been conversations within HUD about trying to look to see what kinds of resources we could potentially dedicate for female veterans.
Thank you. Dr. Lynch, do you have any comments?
I would just add that VA is in the process of really re-engineering its suicide prevention program, trying to continue our emphasis on those at immediate risk, but trying to move a little further to the left to understand those high-risk groups. And women certainly would be included in those high-risk groups, as are homelessness. And the goal is to begin to focus outreach to those groups that could potentially become at risk for suicide over time. So I think, yes, VA is beginning to look at this, and they're beginning to look at it in terms of targeted populations.
Very good. I'm over my time again. I apologize, and I yield back.
I want to thank the gentlelady for her questions, and now yield 5 minutes to Mr. Takano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lynch, as we've heard from service providers earlier this morning, the HUD VASH program is very successful at housing veterans and giving them the support services they need. In communities all across the country, including mine, the HUD VASH program is helping veterans rebuild their lives. Now, my colleague from Pennsylvania, Representative Boyle, has a bill to improve oversight of HUD VASH contracts. It's a straightforward bill that requires the VA to give notice to Congress before a contract expires to help prevent lapses in service for veterans. It's supported by several VSOs, including AMVETS, VVA, DAV, and PVA. Dr. Lynch, are you familiar with this bill?
Only vaguely, having heard about it this morning. But I think VA looks forward to reviewing that bill and to providing feedback, but we don't have specific positions right now.
Well, just can you tell me, as to the core intent of the bill, do you agree that congressional notification is a straightforward fix to help reduce lapses in service for veterans?
Without having looked at the whole bill, Congressman, I'm really reluctant to comment or
well, I'm not asking you to agree with the whole bill, but just the principle of a timely notification to Congress that the program could lapse or funding would lapse, just so that our oversight role is somewhat, I think, enabled here.
I would submit that I think it's always important to communicate with our congressional colleagues, particularly with issues that arise in their district.
Well, with regard to homeless services that are about to lapse, that are about to expire, because the funding is expiring, shouldn't Congress know about that? Shouldn't Congress be informed, hey, this program is about to end or run out of funding here? Shouldn't we be notified about that?
I guess I'm trying to understand, does this relate to the review that recently occurred of some of our homeless programs and the fact that some did not?
Restate that. Maybe I shouldn't say funding, but it requires notice to Congress before a contract expires to help prevent lapses in service to veterans. So it's about a contract expiring, not funding expiring, but a contract expiring with a provider.
At this point, I guess I'm going to have to defer and say until we've had a further chance to look at the bill, I'm going to reserve my opinion at this time.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, thank you. Let me just move on to another question. In October 2013, the VA identified approximately 168,000 enrolled veterans with an HCV diagnosis. And given the diagnosis, given the advancements in Hep C treatments as of March 2017, VA has been able to successfully treat more than 84,000 veterans. While VA continues to work through the list of known veterans, what is VA doing to identify the untreated pool that may still exist out there, specifically at-risk homeless veterans?
We are actively working in the communities with our VSO partners to try to encourage veterans to come forward for testing. This is our current emphasis right now, is to try to increase outreach so that we can identify those veterans who haven't come forward to be identified.
All right, well, thank you. I assume that there's adequate resources to be able to try and find these veterans that are still untreated?
We're actually successfully partnering with a number of our VSO associates to try to encourage that outreach into the community.
Well, in early 2017, Secretary Shulkin laid out his top 5 priorities for VHA. These included 1, greater choice; 2, modernizing the system; 3, strengthening foundational services; 4, timeliness of services; and 5, suicide prevention. Of note, given the topic of this hearing is the fact that homelessness is missing. Since late 2009, VA secretaries have made homelessness a priority, and as a result, veterans experiencing homelessness have been cut nearly in half. In 2017, HUD's annual survey found that veteran homelessness had increased by 1.5% over 2016 figures. Do you believe the agency's downgrading of veteran homelessness from its top priorities is having a direct impact on its ability to help this at-risk population?
I honestly don't believe the agency has downgraded the emphasis on homelessness, Congressman. I think we continue to have a strong emphasis on identifying and treating our homeless veterans.
Well, even as veteran homelessness has increased 1.5% over 2016 figures, and the Secretary has not included this in his top priorities, you can say that with a straight face to me?
Yes, I can, sir.
Can you back that up? 1.5% over the 2016 figures. The facts contradict what you're saying to me.
I think what we know is that there have been circumstances in certain communities that relate to high rent, the decreased availability of housing that we are working on aggressively. But I think VA continues to be committed to the homeless program and basically to addressing homelessness among our veterans. Yes, I do, Congressman.
Well, I would say that that the statistics show otherwise, and I'm not satisfied with your answer, sir.
I'm sorry.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Are there any other follow-up questions from my colleagues? I'm going to go ahead and take a few minutes and follow up with some questions. What you mentioned, Dr. Lynch, the term permanent housing. Explain what that means.
Right now, there's 2 options when we house veterans, and I may ask Dr. Harris to basically expand on this a little bit. There is a process by which we put a veteran into transitional housing, surround him with some supportive services, and then attempt to move him into permanent housing on a long-term basis. There's another model called Housing First, where we try to move the veteran into a permanent housing situation and wrap the services around him at that time.
So I'm going to ask you the same question I ask your partners, your community partners. What is success when it comes to addressing homelessness in the veteran community?
I think success can be defined as identifying a home for veterans, number 1, putting the services in place to keep that veteran in a home, and trying to find employment to make that veteran self-sufficient moving forward. And finally, I think it's having an aggressive prevention strategy that keeps veterans in the home and prevents new veterans from entering homelessness.
I think that's well articulated, those sort of stages of success, and ultimately the outcome desired outcome is that there's a self-sustainability and self-sufficiency. What is the rate of success with respect to the ultimate outcome, desired outcome, for everybody I've listened to in this discussion, which is self-sustainability of the veteran?
Keith, would you like to give an answer to that? with some better numbers than I might be able to give?
Well, if I'm following your question, are you asking for a percentage that, for instance, is housed and sustaining that without a subsidy, for instance?
Yeah, exactly.
Independent.
So you identified this person as homeless, this veteran. You have done this necessary wraparound services to stabilize or rehabilitate, and you've transitioned them through some temporary assistance, and now they are completely self-sufficient.
Sure, and it's an incredibly important question, especially as we look at the long-term sustainability of our efforts. A couple things, there's a million ways we could go with that, but let me just cover a couple
Just
of
give me
them.
one.
Okay, well, the first one is if you look, for instance, at our grant and per diem program, which is the largest of our transitional housing programs by far, 2/3 of the veterans that exit to permanent housing do so with no subsidy, without a HUD-VASH voucher, without a rapid rehousing assistance. I think that's incredibly important. That's why you heard such emphasis, especially, for instance, from Mr. Peck and US Vets, which is a big one of our GPD providers, about the importance of employment. So that is one place where we're seeing independent.
Which program is that?
That was grant and per diem.
Okay.
So my point being, there are successes through these programs that are not requiring subsidy.
Could you give me the same ultimate outcome measurement for all the programs within your
not off the top of my head, but yes.
But you do have them?
We could get that, yes.
Okay. I'd like for you to submit to the committee for the record the outcome of self-sufficiency once you've identified a homeless veteran and you've had them matriculate through whatever program that you have.
Sure.
That you're responsible for.
If I could add one piece, I'm interpreting this as primarily a question about employment. It may not be entirely that. Employment's not a goal, not necessarily a feasible goal for everybody we serve. About 1/3 of the veterans we see are disabled at the point of assessment. If you add in retired or volunteers or students, that number gets up much higher. And for instance, in the HUD-VASH program.
So maybe the way to do it is those that are able to be self-sufficient, what is our success rate?
Sure.
Because I recognize that there are situations where they're not.
Roughly half of the veterans exiting our employment or in HUD-VASH who are able and searching for do in fact obtain employment. So that's a sizable chunk. That's not everybody, and we'd like that to be higher.
For everybody, what are the accountability? I'm not picking on anybody. I just think we have to define success. We have to measure that, and then to know which of the 20 some odd programs are working and where we can. And I'm not against spending more money if a program is working towards our desired outcome to get veterans the help they need in self-sufficiency. But in addition to those things, and the right partners, and by the way, I do think, at least for me, those who are closest to the problem are going to be best able to solve that. And so I put a lot of faith in the community partners in regard to these programs and the program success. But another driver in success of effective programs and services would be accountability. And that's the accountability of the panel that preceded you all, and that's the accountability of the veteran and what they are asked to do and what eligibility, sort of, whether it's time limitations or work requirements or whatever it is. Could you talk about just the accountability measures built into this with respect to the key stakeholders, our veteran and our community partners and providers? I'd start with you and just go down the line, then I'll wrap up.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. With HVRP programs, there is accountability built in. We monitor our grantees on a regular basis and subject them to just criteria. And if they don't meet the criteria, we set them up on a action plan, corrective action plan, to make sure that we work with them. We partner with other folks to work with them and to make sure that they deliver the services that are needed to the specification of the grant in which we gave them money for. At vets and HVRP, we don't measure homelessness as much as we measure how many people get a job. And so for the secretary, he talks about jobs, and that would be our goal. The basic goal of the Department of Labor is making sure veterans homelessness is rare, non-reoccurring, and brief.
And over 60% job placement is what I understand.
Yes, sir, 67%.
That's remarkable. I must say that I was blown away by that statistic. I'd like to drill down at another time, but if that's in fact the success rate, then I think we've identified at least one program that's that we might want to make even greater investment in, because ultimately you can't sustain a home if you don't have a job. So kudos to you guys. If again that success measure is accurate, I don't have any reason to believe it's not. Ms. Blom.
Great.
Accountability.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Is it there? Do you believe it's there sufficiently in your programs?
So we hold our housing authorities accountable for the utilization of the VASH vouchers. Nationwide, we have an 88% utilization rate, which means that 88% of the funding that has been provided to those housing authorities is actually being used to house veterans. Another 5% of funding, going up now to 93% of all the funding available, is in the hands of veterans, but not yet in the form of housing for them. These are veterans that are searching for housing. So we do believe a 93% success rate is very good in the program. Of course, we want to see that tick up, particularly in the high-cost areas such as LA and
When you say
Seattle.
93% success rate, what does that measure again?
It's the measurement of funding that is being expended to house veterans. So today, that's 88% of all funding that the department has dedicated to the HUD-VASH program is being used to house veterans. And as a result of that, we have 77,000 veterans that are currently housed. Another 5% of that funding is in the hands of veterans to be able to search for a house so that they can live in stable
Do you know of the 93% that you give assistance to for housing? How many of those individuals move off of federal assistance who can sustain their own housing?
So today we rely on the VA for those types of statistics. The VA, as I understand, tracks exits of VASH vouchers either as positive, neutral, or a negative outcome as a result of ending their participation in the VASH program.
Okay. Dr. Lynch, you get the last word.
Pretty much what Ms. Bloom said. We're tracking how many veterans successfully are housed following involvement in our programs. We track how many do not get housed. And also importantly, we track how many fall back into homelessness. And these are solid numbers, and we're able to track those for our programs across the country.
And one last question, if my colleagues will indulge me here. I just, kind of a rapid round closure, and we'll start on this end, and Mr. Miller, you close us out. What is not, everybody comes putting their best foot and presentation forward, and I appreciate that, and I bet there is success. If some may be more wildly successful than others, but I just have to believe there's something that's not working, and so I'm a continual improvement guy myself. I can tell you there's a lot of things not working in my own operation I'd like to fix and am working on. So could you tell me what's not working about your program, where we can help you? If not, if we can't help you, just tell me that you're working on it, and that to a greater avail for our veterans.
Dr. Harris would like to start, and
real
I would
quickly,
like
just
to follow.
10 seconds.
Sure. I think the biggest one is a lack of prevention. I think we're seeing too many people falling into homelessness, and it's not a failure of the homeless system. It's a broader failure of the entire societal system, and we need to go upstream further than we have.
And that may address some of the discussion around TAP, if we could make that more robust and effective. Okay, good.
I would say very briefly that I think our greatest opportunity is to look at how we can partner more effectively, particularly with the community, learn from their experience and incorporate that into our program overall.
Excellent. Ms. Blom.
Great. And I'll focus my remarks on tribal HUD-VASH. There's a Senate bill that was introduced, Senate 1333, that would permanently authorize the tribal HUD-VASH program that would help communities be able to project-base those vouchers and, again, produce stable housing for veterans long-term in Indian country.
Thank you, Ms. Blum. Mr. Miller, final word.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, as stated in our 2016 annual report to Congress, one of our things that we would like to work with you on is the technical amendment to the term homeless veteran to include recently housed. We estimate that if that were changed, we would be able to serve 10,000 more veterans.
Excellent.
homeless veterans.
Okay, well, God bless you guys, and thanks for coming. And if there are no further questions, then the panel is now excused. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys.